the hook. On the night of his own wedding, Damien Voss did something that no amount of money, power, or reputation could ever fully erase. He walked out of the reception hall, got into a black car, and drove to another woman's apartment while his bride was still wearing her dress. Serena Vale sat at the head table for 40 minutes before she realized her husband wasn't coming back from the bathroom. She found his phone on the vanity. She found the tablet inside his jacket pocket. And in the space of 6 minutes, scrolling through 3 years of messages she was never supposed to see, she understood everything: why he married her, what she was worth to him, and exactly how long the man she loved had been laughing behind her back. She didn't scream. She didn't throw anything. She sat back down at the table, finished her champagne, and smiled for the cameras. Then she started planning. If you've ever had someone use your love against you, if you've ever trusted the wrong person, completely stay with this story. Subscribe to this channel and follow Serena's story all the way to the end, because what this woman does next will take your breath away. Hit the like button and drop your city or country in the comments. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. The wedding had cost $400,000. Damien Voss had insisted on every detail: the white peonies imported from the Netherlands, the private orchestra, the venue on the waterfront that required a 6-month reservation, and a deposit larger than most people's annual salary. He had reviewed the seating arrangements himself. He had approved the menu. He had stood at the altar in a charcoal Italian suit and watched Serena walk toward him with an expression that looked, from a distance, like devotion. Serena had believed it was devotion. She had been wrong about a great many things that year. She'd been wrong about the length of the relationship. What she thought was 2 years of genuine courtship had been, according to the messages on that tablet, an 18-month calculation. Damien had identified her 6 months before he ever walked into the gallery opening where they supposedly met by chance. Her family name, Vale, was attached to a corporate licensing agreement that gave whoever married into it indirect access to 3 municipal contracts in Boston and a real estate portfolio that the city had quietly revalued the previous spring. Damien's lawyers had flagged it. His lieutenant, a man named Ellis Crane, had brought him the file. And Damien had reviewed her photograph, her schedule, her habits, and her personality profile assembled by people she had never met before he ever introduced himself as a man who simply liked her smile. She learned all of this in 6 minutes. The tablet had been a gift from Ellis to Damien, a secondary device untethered from Damien's main accounts, used specifically for communication that couldn't survive discovery. It had been left in the jacket pocket by carelessness, or maybe by Ellis deliberately, though consider that possibility until much later. What mattered was that the jacket had been draped over the vanity chair in the bridal suite, and when Serena reached for it to check the time, the screen lit up. She read the most recent message first. She settled. Go. The response from Damien's number had been sent 11 minutes ago. On my way. Serena put the tablet down. She picked it back up. She scrolled backward with the careful, deliberate movements of someone who already understood they were dismantling their own life and had chosen to do it anyway, because the alternative was to keep building on a foundation that wasn't there. The woman's name was Kira Solis. Serena knew Kira Solis. She had known her for 4 years. Kira had been her closest friend through the death of Serena's mother, through the dissolution of her first engagement to a man who had turned out to be spectacularly unsuited to commitment, through the difficult months when Serena had been rebuilding her mother's architecture firm from a 2-person operation into something sustainable. Kira sat across from her at kitchen tables and wine bars and hospital waiting rooms. She had held Serena's hand at the funeral. She had been the first person Serena called when Damien proposed. Kira's response to the proposal, relayed in a text thread Serena had saved on her own phone, had been "Say yes immediately. He's the one." On the tablet, in a message sent 4 months earlier, Kira had written to Damien, "She trusts me completely. She'll never question anything I tell her about you." Damien's response, "Keep it that way." Serena sat with this information for exactly 4 minutes. She was aware of the sounds from the reception hall, the orchestra finishing a slow waltz, the murmur of 200 guests who had been told the bride would return shortly. She was aware of her own breathing, which was steadier than it had any right to be. She was aware that she had champagne on her dress, from when a guest's elbow had caught her glass during the first hour, a small pale stain near the hem that the seamstress would have been horrified by. She thought about her mother. Margaret Vale had built her firm without anyone handing her the contracts. She had fought municipal boards and rival architects. and the particular brand of institutional skepticism reserved for women who wanted to design public buildings instead of private homes. She had raised Serena alone after the divorce, working long hours and never once suggesting that any of it was harder than she was willing to handle. Serena had grown up, watching her mother negotiate from positions of disadvantage and walk away having extracted something real from every situation. "Don't let them see what they've cost you," Margaret had told her once. "Not until you've decided what you want in exchange." Serena smoothed her dress. She reapplied her lipstick using the mirror above the vanity. She placed the tablet back inside Damien's jacket pocket and returned the jacket to its position on the chair, angled exactly as she had found it. Then she walked back into the reception hall and danced with her father-in-law for 2 songs. Nobody suspected anything. That was her first real act of power, though she wouldn't name it that until later. The marriage lasted in practical terms 6 weeks. They occupied the same penthouse on the 43rd floor of a building Damien owned outright, slept in the same bed, appeared at the same functions. Serena prepared coffee every morning the way she always had: dark roast, no sugar, left on the counter at 6:15 because Damien was always awake before 6. She attended the dinners, she signed the cards, she wore the ring. In the spaces between all of that, she was methodical. Her mother had left her the architecture firm and a small personal trust that was completely separate from any financial arrangement connected to Damien or the Vale family licensing agreements. Serena had always kept her own accounts, her own professional contacts, her own passport in her own drawer. She had not understood, until the night of the wedding, how significant that would turn out to be. She found a lawyer on her second day back from what the guests believed was a honeymoon in Portugal. She had gone to Portugal. She had spent 3 days in Lisbon, alone walking through the old neighborhoods near the waterfront and eating meals at small restaurants where no one knew her face. She had let herself be afraid there in private, where it didn't cost her anything. She had sat on a terrace above the Tagus River and allowed herself to understand fully what had been done to her. Then she had come home and started working. The lawyer's name was Catherine Holt. She operated out of a small firm in Cambridge that specialized in corporate dissolution and matrimonial asset litigation. She was 62, direct, and had a gift for communicating complex legal maneuvering in plain, almost clinical language that Serena found clarifying rather than cold. Their first meeting lasted 3 hours. Serena brought printed documentation of everything she had found on the tablet. She had photographed each screen before replacing it, her hands completely steady, along with a written summary of every document she had signed during her relationship with Damien, annotated with her own notes about what she had understood each signature to mean at the time. Catherine read through all of it without interrupting. When she finished, she set the papers down and looked at Serena directly. "He needed your name on 3 specific agreements," Catherine said. "If we can establish that your consent was obtained under false pretenses, which this documentation strongly suggests, those signatures can be challenged. Will challenging them hurt his business?" Catherine considered this with the careful neutralities of someone who had been asked that question before. "It will create complications. The investors in the municipal contracts will require documentation of clear title. If title is disputed, some of them will withdraw until it's resolved. That will take time, and time costs money." Serena nodded. "What else?" "The licensing agreements themselves are structured around the Vale family name. Your participation isn't just symbolic, it's contractually load-bearing. If you remove yourself properly and formally, the structure shifts. Some of it may not hold. How long will the whole process take?" "Months, possibly longer, depending on how aggressively he responds." Serena thought about this. "He won't respond aggressively," she said. "Not toward me," Catherine raised an eyebrow. "He has a public image to protect," Serena said, "and he doesn't believe I know enough to be dangerous." She paused. "He's wrong about that." Catherine allowed herself a small, controlled smile. "Then we have an advantage." Serena discovered she was pregnant on a Tuesday morning in October. She was standing in the bathroom of Catherine Holt's office, having arrived early for a meeting, when the test confirmed what she had been half refusing to consider for 9 days. She sat on the edge of the sink for a long moment. Outside the frosted window, she could hear the street, a delivery truck, someone's phone, the ordinary sounds of a city that had no idea what had just shifted inside a small tiled room in Cambridge. She did the math. The timing was unambiguous. She had not told Damien about any of it. Not the lawyer, not the documentation, not the quiet hours she spent at her desk in the architecture firm, reviewing which of her professional relationships were genuinely hers and which had been cultivated through connections Damien had arranged. She had said nothing. She had been patient and careful, and she had watched him across their shared dinner table and understood that he had never once looked at her and wondered what she was thinking. That was his fundamental error, and she had protected it carefully. Standing in that bathroom holding the test, she understood that the calculation had changed. A child changed everything. A child belonging to Damien Voss feared, connected, genuinely dangerous in ways that corporate law couldn't fully address, was not a detail she could manage the way she was managing the signatures in the contracts. A child was a person. A child was a living line of connection to a man she was in the process of disappearing from. She thought about it for a long time, not weeks, not days. She stood in that bathroom for 11 minutes and thought about every version of the decision, and when she sat across from Catherine and said, "I'm going to need the process to move faster." Catherine looked at her. "Something changed?" "My timeline changed," Serena said. "I need everything finalized before he realizes what's happening." She didn't tell Catherine about the pregnancy. She didn't tell anyone. The withdrawal took 4 months. Document by document, Serena removed her name from everything that could be cleanly removed. Where clean removal wasn't possible, Catherine filed formal challenges that placed the agreements in a state of legal uncertainty that would require resolution before any new business could proceed. Damien's team became aware of the activity in the second month. His lawyers contacted Catherine's office. Catherine responded with meticulous, unhurried correspondence that confirmed every action was being taken in full compliance with applicable law and declined to engage in speculation about Serena's intentions. Damien himself called Serena once. It was a Sunday afternoon. She was at the architecture firm, reviewing drawings for a small restoration project she'd taken on a 19th century commercial building in Somerville, whose owners wanted the facade preserved while the interior was completely restructured. The work required a particular kind of attention, finding what was worth saving, understanding what the original builders had intended, working within the bones of something old to make it functional for a completely different future. She had come to find this kind of work clarifying. Her phone lit up with Damien's name. She let it ring 3 times. Then she answered, "Serena." His voice was careful. She had been the one who studied him for 2 years. She knew when he was performing ease. He was performing it now. "Damien, I think we should talk." "I agree," she said. "My lawyer's available Tuesday or Thursday." A beat of silence. "I wasn't suggesting a legal meeting." "I know you weren't." She kept her voice even, unhurried. "But that's what I'm suggesting." Another silence, longer than the first. She could hear him deciding whether to push. He didn't push. "Thursday," he said. "I'll let Catherine know." She hung up and returned to the drawings. At the Thursday meeting, Damien sat across from her at a conference table for the first time as an adversary rather than a husband. He had brought 2 lawyers, and Ellis Crane, who sat to his right with a yellow legal pad and a stillness that Serena had come to understand meant he was watching for information rather than participating in the conversation. Serena had brought Catherine in a single folder. Damien looked at her for a long moment before the meeting started. She met his gaze without hostility, without warmth, without anything he could use. "I'd like to understand your position," he said. "My position," Serena said, "is documented in the filings Catherine has already provided to your office." "The filings create complications." "Yes." He waited for her to say more. She didn't. "Serena." He shifted slightly. "We're still married." "We are," she agreed. "That's a separate matter." Ellis made a note on his legal pad. Damien's expression didn't change, but she saw something move through his eyes, not anger exactly. Something more like recalibration. He was revising his model of her, she understood. He had arrived believing she would be emotional or conciliatory, or at minimum willing to be managed. And he was discovering that none of those assumptions were accurate. "What do you want?" he said. It was the first question he had ever asked her. She had prepared for it carefully. "I want my name removed from every agreement in which I did not have full understanding of the terms at the time of signing." Catherine has identified 7 such agreements. The legal basis for challenge is documented. "I'd like this resolved without extended litigation." "And the marriage?" "That's a separate conversation for a separate day." Damien looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at Ellis. Something passed between them that she didn't have the angle to read. "Fine," Damien said. "We'll review Catherine's documentation." The meeting ended 40 minutes later. Nothing was resolved, but she had established something more important than resolution. She had established that she would not be negotiated with emotionally. That whatever she wanted, she would take through legitimate process, with patience, in ways he couldn't intercept. She was 4 months pregnant at that meeting, and her coat was cut to disguise it. He didn't notice. She left Boston on a Friday in February. The firm had been restructured. She'd promoted her senior associate, a quiet, capable woman named Dana Reyes, to managing director, with a formal agreement that preserved Serena's ownership interest while removing her from daily operations. The personal trust from her mother had been moved. Her apartment lease had been allowed to expire. Her mail had been forwarded to Catherine's office with instructions that Catherine would communicate anything legally relevant. She left no forwarding address. She flew to Dublin, then took a train south into the countryside, then another connection east, and eventually arrived in a small city on the Adriatic coast of Slovenia, where she had worked briefly 6 years earlier on a restoration project, and still knew a few people, a former colleague, an elderly woman who ran a pension near the Old Town Center, a property manager who occasionally had short-term rentals available for architects working seasonal contracts. The city was called Peron. It sat on a narrow peninsula jutting into the sea, an old Venetian town with narrow streets and salt-flat air and buildings that required constant maintenance because the sea was always working on them. There was reliable work for someone who knew how to read old stone and understand what it needed. There was a quiet that Boston hadn't offered in years. She rented a 3-room apartment near the top of the hill, with windows that looked out over the rooftops toward the water, and she let herself stop moving. She was 5 months along. The pregnancy had been uncomplicated, which she was aware was a form of luck she hadn't done anything to earn. She had found a doctor in Koper, a 40-minute drive north, who was direct and competent and asked no unnecessary questions about her situation. She had assembled a small, functional life from the materials available. On a Thursday morning in late May, she went to the hospital in Koper and came back 3 days later with a son. She named him Theo, almost immediately. He had dark hair and a focused, serious expression that she recognized from photographs of her mother as an infant. He weighed 6 pounds and 11 ounces, and he slept in 4-hour stretches, and he looked at her, in the first hours, with the particular intensity of someone who has arrived somewhere new and is making immediate assessments. She sat in the hospital room the first night and looked at him and felt something rearrange inside her that she didn't have a name for. Not just love, though it was that. Something more structural. Understanding that she had built this specific life, this specific child, out of the wreckage of what had been done to her. That Damien's calculation had produced, among its many unintended consequences, this person. She thought about whether she should tell him. She thought about it for a long time, lying in the narrow hospital bed, with Theo in the bassinet beside her, listening to the sounds of the ward beyond the door. Then she stopped thinking about it. He would not find her. And if he ever did, she would make a decision then, from a position of strength, with enough time and distance between herself and the woman who had sat at the wedding table and smiled for the cameras. For now, Theo needed her completely. And for the first time in a long while, being needed completely felt like the right shape for her life. Back in Boston, things were going wrong for Damien Voss. The legal challenges had created exactly the complications Catherine predicted. 3 of the 7 disputed agreements had been placed in formal mediation, and 2 investors who had been waiting for resolution had withdrawn pending clarification of title. Damien's lawyers were expensive and thorough and had managed to slow the process, but slowing it was the most they could accomplish. The underlying documentation was solid. Catherine's filings were airtight, and the legal exposure was real regardless of how many hours his team logged in conference rooms arguing otherwise. His most trusted lieutenant was the source of his next problem. Ellis Crane had been with Damien for 9 years. He had been present at every significant decision, every acquisition, every negotiation. He knew where everything was: the assets, the vulnerabilities, the arrangements that existed outside standard documentation. He had sat to Damien's right at the Thursday meeting and watched Serena dismantle her participation in the corporate structure without a trace of visible emotion, and something in that observation had apparently triggered a calculation of his own. In the 3rd month after Serena's disappearance, Ellis approached 3 of Damien's mid-level business partners separately and proposed a reorganization. Damien found out on a Tuesday. The meeting that followed lasted less than 20 minutes. Ellis did not return to the office afterward. He left Boston within 48 hours and relocated to a city that was far enough away to be inconvenient and close enough that the message was clear. He was not afraid of Damien, but he understood the geometry of the situation. Damien did not pursue him. He thought about why he didn't pursue him, and he couldn't arrive at an explanation that satisfied him. He was not a man who let defections go unanswered. He had built his organization on the precise understanding that consequences were consistent and unavoidable. The other men knew this. They watched what he did with Ellis, and they watched him do nothing, and he saw the watching, and he understood that something had shifted in him in a way that the people around him were beginning to notice. He thought about Serena. He had spent 3 years thinking about Serena in the way that men think about problems they created themselves and cannot solve, circling it, returning to it, occasionally convincing themselves they had resolved it, and then finding it back in the same place when they looked again. He had people looking for her. Not aggressively, he had been specific about that, though he couldn't have explained clearly why. He wanted to know she was safe. He wanted to know where she was. He told himself these were the thoughts of a man who still had legal obligations to his wife. He found nothing. She had gone somewhere with enough forethought to leave no trail he could follow, and this, he understood eventually, was the most honest communication she had sent him. She had not wanted to be found. She had made herself unfindable, and the woman who had accomplished that was not the woman he had assessed in that file. Ellis had brought him 3 years ago, passive, grieving, easily managed by someone who understood her need for stability. He had underestimated her completely. He sat with this understanding in his office on the 43rd floor, looking out at a city that was technically still organized around his interests, and he thought about the moment on the wedding night when she had looked at him before he left. He had told himself afterward that she hadn't seen anything, that she was tired, that it was just the end of a long day catching up with her expression. He knew now that she had seen everything, and she had let him walk out the door and said nothing. He thought about what that decision had cost her. He thought about the 4 months she had spent methodically removing herself from his life while sleeping in the same bed. He thought about how thoroughly she had understood him, his arrogance, certainty that his power made him unreadable, his belief that the people around him were responding to him rather than managing him. She had managed him beautifully. For the first time, this did not make him angry. It made him understand that he was the kind of man who could be managed that way, that his confidence in his own intelligence had been the precise mechanism of his undoing. That somewhere in the world there was a woman raising a child he didn't know about, he suspected, without proof, without confirmation, in the hollow way that knowledge sometimes arrives before the evidence, and she had become that woman because of choices he had made on the night of their wedding. He did not know how to fix it. He didn't know fixing it was something he deserved to do. He stayed in his office for a long time that evening after his staff had left, looking at the lights of the city and thinking about what kind of man he was going to be for the rest of his life, whether he was going to be the man in the file, the one who calculated and positioned and treated people as variables in a larger equation, or whether he was capable of becoming something different. He didn't have an answer. He wasn't sure he was the right person to decide. Theo turned 1 in May. Serena made him a cake with lemon icing and a single candle, and invited the elderly woman from the pension, whose name was Marija, and the former colleague, whose name was Luca, and Luca's wife and their 2 daughters, who immediately appointed themselves Theo's senior advisors in all matters relating to toys and snack selection. It was a good afternoon. Theo sat in his high chair and examined the cake with deep suspicion before deciding it had merit. Maria held him for 20 minutes after dinner and sang to him in Slovenian in a low, unhurried voice, and Theo fell asleep in her arms with the particular trusting weight of a child who has decided the person holding him is safe. Serena watched this from across the table and thought about her mother. Margaret Vale had been gone for 4 years. She had died of what everyone agreed was a cardiac event at 61, alone in her office on a Friday evening in March. The medical examiner had found nothing concerning. The circumstances had seemed, to everyone who knew her, simply terrible. A healthy woman, working too hard, gone too soon. Serena had grieved her completely. She had gone through the stages as they came and not tried to manage them. She had kept the firm running because her mother would have wanted her to keep it running. She had accepted condolences from people who had loved her mother, and from people who had barely known her, and from people who she suspected were more interested in the estate than in Margaret Vale, the person. She had never once questioned the manner of her death. It was a former investigator who first made her question it. His name was Gerald Mace. He had worked for the Boston Police Department for 23 years and for a private firm for 7 years after that. He was 68 and had been diagnosed with lung cancer the previous winter. He had been, at various points in his career, hired to conduct background investigations for Serena's stepfather's family, the Harding side, the side that had entered Serena's life when Margaret remarried 8 years before her death. He found Serena through Dana Reyes at the architecture firm. He left a handwritten message, which Dana forwarded, with a phone number in 2 sentences. I need to tell you something about your mother. I don't have much time to tell it. Serena called him from a payphone in Piran's Old Town Center, standing in the narrow street with the sea wind coming off the water and Theo asleep in the carrier against her chest. Gerald Mace answered on the second ring. She found something, he said, in the family accounts. Your stepfather's family had a financing arrangement that shouldn't have existed. It ran through a shell company connected to 2 city contracts that Margaret's firm was supposedly competing for. She couldn't have won those contracts fairly because the decision had already been made before the bids were submitted, and she knew it. Serena held the phone against her ear and kept her hand against Theo's back. She was going to go to the city oversight board, Gerald said. She had documentation. She told me she was going to file within 2 weeks. He paused. She died 11 days later. The sea wind moved through the street. Who knew she was going to file, Serena said. That's what I couldn't answer when it happened, Gerald said. I was hired to do a background check on a contractor that year, not to investigate Margaret. But I knew what she'd told me, and when she died, I went back and I looked at the timing, and I could never make myself believe it was coincidence. Who do you think knew? He was quiet for a moment. Your sister was close to the Harding side, he said. She had her own financial arrangements with your stepfather's family. I don't know what she knew or when she knew it. But if Margaret told anyone in the family she was going to file, he stopped. Serena's hand pressed harder against Theo's back. Why are you telling me this now? She said. Because I'm running out of time to tell anyone, he said, and because Margaret Vale deserved better than what she got. And because you're the only person I can tell who might actually do something about it. She stood in the street for a long time after the call ended. Theo shifted in the carrier, made a small sound, and settled again. She thought about her sister Claire. Bright, careful Claire, who had always been the one who knew which rooms to be in and which conversations to be part of. Who had managed the family dynamics of the Harding remarriage with a smoothness that Serena had always attributed to social intelligence. Who had been the one to tell Serena, the week before Margaret died, that their mother seemed more stressed than usual lately. Serena had thought at the time that Claire was being observant. Now she thought about what else being observant might mean. She looked down at Theo's dark hair against her chest. She thought about Margaret Vale sitting alone in her office on a Friday evening in March, with documentation she was going to submit in 11 days, and whether she had been afraid. She hoped her mother hadn't been afraid. She thought she probably had been. Serena walked back up the hill toward her apartment, with her son asleep against her heart, and the sea behind her, and a decision forming that she hadn't made yet, but could already feel the weight of the understanding that there was one more thing she needed to do before she could fully step into the life she was building. She needed to go back, not for Damien, not for the marriage, not for any of the corporate wreckage she had already walked away from, for her mother. And if walking back meant Damien would find out about Theo, then she would handle that when it came from a position of strength with enough of herself intact to make decisions that were right rather than simply safe. She had learned to trust her own timing. She trusted it now. Serena booked the flight on a Wednesday. She didn't tell Dana she was coming. She didn't contact Catherine Holt until she was already in the air, somewhere over the Atlantic with Theo asleep across her lap, and the cabin dark around her, and her laptop open to a folder of documents she had been building. For 6 weeks, Gerald Mace's account, transcribed in full, the timeline she had reconstructed from her mother's calendar entries and billing records, and the firm's project logs from the year before Margaret died. She had requested those records from Dana 6 months earlier under the pretext of completing a tax filing, and Dana had sent them without question because Dana had no reason to question anything Serena asked for. The folder was 47 pages. She had read it so many times that she could recite sections from memory, but she read it again on the plane because reading it kept her focused on the thing she was going back for, rather than the thing she was going back toward. Damien Voss was still in Boston. She knew this because Catherine had continued to file correspondence with his legal team throughout the 3 years, a slow, bureaucratic exchange that kept the disputed agreements in a state of unresolved tension and required Damien's lawyers to confirm his address of record at regular intervals. He was in the same building, same floor, possibly the same office with the same view of the same city. She was not going back for him. She repeated this to herself the way you repeat something that is true but not yet fully felt. Theo stirred against her. She put her hand on his back and he settled, and she looked at his face in the dim light, the dark lashes, the soft, serious mouth, the way his brow furrowed slightly even in sleep, as though he were working something out, and she thought about what Gerald Mace had said. "You're the only person I can tell who might actually do something about it." Gerald had died 3 weeks after their phone call. Dana had found his obituary and forwarded it without comment. Lung cancer, as he'd said, he'd made it to 68. The obituary mentioned a daughter in New Hampshire and 30 years of service and a fondness for fly fishing. It did not mention Margaret Vale. It did not mention the conversation he'd had with a woman standing in a narrow street in Slovenia with her infant son against her chest. He had trusted her with the truth before he ran out of time to tell it. She owed him the completion of it. She arrived in Boston on a Thursday morning in October, 3 years and 8 months after she had left. The city looked the same and felt entirely different, which she understood was because she was entirely different. She had arranged a sublet through a contact of Luke's a furnished apartment in Cambridge, 2 bedrooms, available month to month, owned by a professor on sabbatical in Japan who wanted someone reliable to water the plants and collect the mail. It was on a quiet street lined with old maples that had already turned, and when she stood at the window the first evening with Theo on her hip, pointing at the colors, she thought that her mother would have liked the light. She called Catherine the next morning. "I need a meeting," Serena said, "and I need it to stay off the record for now." Catherine's voice was careful. "Off the record in what sense?" "In the sense that I'm not ready to be findable yet." A pause. "Are you in Boston?" "Yes." Another pause longer. "Can you come to the office this afternoon?" "I'll be there at 2. She brought Theo in a stroller and left him with Catherine's assistant, a patient young man named Marcus, who produced a set of colored markers and a legal pad from somewhere and settled Theo at his desk with the gravity of someone undertaking important work. Theo accepted this arrangement and began drawing with the focused intensity he brought to most things, and Serena followed Catherine into the inner office and sat down and put the 47-page folder on the table. Catherine read it in silence. She read the whole thing, which took 20 minutes, while Serena sat with her hands folded and watched the afternoon light move across the window behind Catherine's desk. When Catherine finished, she closed the folder. "Gerald Mace," she said. "He died in August. I know who he was." Catherine set the folder down flat on the desk. He was credible. He had a reputation for accuracy. If he said Margaret was going to file, she was going to file. "I know. This is a different kind of investigation than what we've been doing," Catherine said. "What we've been doing is civil. What you're describing is potentially criminal." "I know that too. If your sister was involved." Catherine stopped. "Serena, what do you want to happen?" "I had thought about this for 6 weeks on a hillside while her son learned to walk, and her mother's death rearranged itself in her memory from tragedy into something colder and more deliberate. I want to know what happened," she said. "All of it. And then I want it in front of the right people. The right people being whoever has jurisdiction. City oversight if the corruption angle holds. The DA's office if there's something beyond the financial piece." Catherine was quiet for a moment. "If your stepfather's family is involved at the financial level and your sister provided information that helped cover it, that's a wide exposure." "Yes." "Are you prepared for what that does to what's left of your family?" Serena thought about Claire. Claire at the funeral, dry-eyed and organized, managing the logistics with the efficiency of someone who had been preparing. Claire in the years since, sending occasional texts that Serena had answered briefly and without warmth, maintaining the minimum architecture of a sibling relationship. Claire, who had told her their mother seemed stressed the week before she died. "My family," Serena said, "ended when my mother did. I just didn't understand it at the time. She'd been back for 11 days when Damien found out. She didn't know how he found out. She suspected it was a filing. Catherine had submitted a new document to the mediation process using Serena's legal address, which was still Catherine's office, but which required a notation that the petitioner was now residing in the jurisdiction. It was procedural. It was necessary. It was apparently enough. His name appeared on her phone at 7:15 on a Sunday morning. She was in the kitchen. Theo was eating toast and examining a wooden train he'd carried from Slovenia. He traveled with it in his hand, not in his bag, which meant it had been held through 2 airports and an overnight flight, and was now somewhat sticky with the residue of 3 years of being Theo's most trusted possession. She was drinking coffee and watching him work out why the wheels spun in one direction more smoothly than the other when her phone buzzed on the counter. Damien Voss. She looked at the name for a moment. Then she picked up the phone and set it face down without answering. She finished her coffee. She cleaned up the kitchen. She got Theo dressed in the particular negotiation that dressing a 2-year-old quite a firm position on which socks were acceptable, a counteroffer involving a shirt with a truck on it, an eventual compromise that satisfied no one completely but produced a dressed child. She put him in the stroller and walked 2 blocks to a small bakery on Massachusetts Avenue that she had discovered in the first week and already considered essential. She bought a coffee and a plain croissant and sat at a table by the window while Theo consumed his half of the croissant with the serious deliberation he brought to things he found genuinely worthwhile. Her phone buzzed again. A text, this time, I know you're here. I'm not going to cause problems, can we talk? No question mark. Which was Damien. He phrased requests as statements because somewhere in the structure of his thinking, the question mark introduced an uncertainty he found destabilizing. She typed back through Catherine. Same as always. His response came in under a minute. I'm not asking for a legal meeting. She put the phone in her pocket. Theo held out the remaining quarter of his croissant, considered it, and withdrew the offer. Smart, she said. He looked at her with Damien's eyes and ate the croissant. The meeting she hadn't agreed to happened anyway. She was coming out of Catherine's building on Tuesday afternoon, Theo in the stroller, her bag over one shoulder, her mind still inside the conversation she'd just finished with Catherine and a former city auditor named Reeves, who had been quietly reviewing the Harding financial records for the past 3 weeks. Reeves was methodical and unhurried and had the particular energy of someone who had been waiting a long time to find exactly this kind of paperwork. He had found 3 discrepancies in the first week. By Tuesday, he was up to 11. She pushed through the glass door, and Damien was on the sidewalk. He was alone. No security, which was either a statement or a trap, and she stood in the doorway for a half second, assessing which before she let the door close behind her and Sticktheachem moved past him toward the stroller she'd left with Marcus in the lobby while she was in the meeting. Serena, she didn't stop. I told you, Catherine. I just want 5 minutes. You don't get 5 minutes because you want them. That's not how this works. She went back inside and got the stroller and came back out, and he was still there, standing with his hands in the pockets of a coat she didn't recognize, which struck her as an odd thing to notice. 3 years. Of course he had different coats. He looked at the stroller. He looked at Theo. She watched him look at Theo with the particular alertness of someone who was doing math without realizing they were doing math, and she felt something tighten in her chest that she did not let reach her face. How old? He said. That's not a conversation we're having on this sidewalk. Serena Damien. She kept her voice flat and even and looked at him directly. If you want to talk, go through Catherine. If you show up somewhere I am again without my agreement, I will handle it legally, and it will be expensive in public. Do you understand me? He looked at her for a long moment. His face had changed in 3 years. Not dramatically, he was still the same constructed man, controlled and well-maintained, but there was something around his eyes that hadn't been there before. Not softness. Something more like damage that had been lived with long enough to become familiar. I'm not here to fight you, he said. I know. But I don't need your reasons for being here. I need you to leave. He left. She stood on the sidewalk and watched him walk to a car parked half a block down and get in, and she waited until the car pulled away before she let herself breathe at the full depth her lungs were asking for. Theo pointed at a pigeon. Bird, she said. Bah, he agreed. She pushed the stroller north toward Cambridge and did not look back. Claire called that evening. Serena had been expecting it, though not quite so soon. The Harding family had resources and relationships that extended into enough of Boston's professional community that word of Reeves's inquiries had almost certainly reached someone connected to them within the past week. She had anticipated this. She had not anticipated that the first call would come from Claire rather than from a lawyer representing the Hardings. That told her something. I heard you were back, Claire said. Her voice was careful in a way it had never been when they were younger. Claire had always been the more fluid conversationalist, easy, adaptable, capable of making a room feel comfortable. What Serena was hearing now was the version of Claire that existed when comfort wasn't the objective. I'm back, Serena said. For how long? Unclear. A short pause. I heard you have a baby. A toddler now. That stopped. I didn't know. No, you didn't tell me. No, Serena said again. I didn't. The silence between them had a texture. Serena had known Claire for her entire life. She had shared a bathroom with her and argued over television schedules and sat beside her at their mother's funeral and felt at the time that whatever else had gone wrong in the Harding years, she and Claire were still something solid, that the sisterhood was the one thing in the family structure that was real and uncomplicated. She had believed a great many things that turned out to be wrong. I need to ask you something, Serena said. Okay. Claire's voice was very still. Did Mom tell you she was going to file a complaint city oversight? The silence that followed was different from the ones before it. It was the silence of someone who has just understood what conversation they are actually in. What? Claire said. Before she died. Did she tell you she'd found financial irregularities in the Harding accounts and was going to report them? Serena, yes or no, Claire? That's not, you can't just, where is this coming from? Answer the question. I don't know what you're talking about. Claire's voice had shifted into something higher and faster, a register Serena recognized from childhood as the sound of Claire constructing a position under pressure. Mom never told me anything like that. If she had, I would have, that's a serious accusation, Serena, and I don't appreciate. I'm not accusing you of anything yet, Serena said. I'm asking whether she told you. No, Claire said. She didn't tell me, and I think you should be very careful about whatever you're doing, because if you're implying what I think you're implying, I'm not implying anything. I'm asking a direct question and you've answered it. Serena, listen to me. Claire's voice dropped. You've been gone for 3 years. You don't know what it's been like. The family has been... There have been a lot of pressures that you weren't here for. I need you to think about what you're about to do very carefully before you do it. I have been thinking about it, Serena said, for 6 weeks. Very carefully. You have a child. You need to think about what kind of stability you're... Don't, Serena said. The word came out quiet and sharp and it stopped Claire mid-sentence. Don't talk to me about my child's stability. That's not a road you want to walk. The silence stretched. She was my mother too, Claire said. Her voice had changed again. Something in it was different, lower, stripped of the defensive register. Whatever you think happened, she was my mother too. I know that, Serena said. Which is why I hoped you'd answer me honestly. She ended the call. She sat for a moment at the kitchen table with her phone face down in front of her and listened to the apartment around her. The small sounds of Theo asleep in the next room. The heat coming through the pipes, the distant sound of a car on the street below. Normal sounds. A life that worked. She thought about Claire saying she was my mother too in that stripped-down voice. She thought about whether that was genuine grief or a strategic move, whether Claire was mourning or calculating. She thought about the fact that she could no longer distinguish between the two, and whether that was because Claire had blurred the line or because Serena's own instincts had been recalibrated by too much experience with people who performed emotion rather than felt it. She didn't know. That was the honest answer. She didn't know what Claire had known or what she had done or what she had told herself to make it livable afterward. She had only Gerald Mace's account and the Harding financial records, and 11 discrepancies that were growing in number by the week. She knew what she was going to do with them. She was less certain about what she was going to do about the look on Damien's face when he'd seen the stroller. Reeves found the connection on a Friday. He called Catherine, who called Serena, who drove to Catherine's office with Theo in the car seat and parked on the street and sat in the lobby with Theo on her lap, while Catherine came down to meet her because the office elevator was too slow and Catherine's voice on the phone had. The quality of someone who has found something they were not sure they were ready to find. The shell company, Catherine said, sitting down across from her in the lobby chairs, keeping her voice low with Theo present. The one Gerald Mace identified, the one connected to the city contracts. We have documentation of 2 wire transfers made from a Harding family account 11 months before your mother died. Serena held Theo a little more firmly. To whom, she said. That's the part, Catherine said. One transfer went to an account we haven't fully traced yet. The second transfer went to a consulting firm that we have now connected to an individual who was employed at the City Oversight Board at the time your mother would have filed. Serena was quiet. If your mother's complaint had reached the board, Catherine said carefully, this individual would have been in a position to ensure it went nowhere, or to alert the Hardings that it was coming. So they paid someone inside the board to intercept her complaint. That's what the records suggest, but she never filed. No, because she died first. Catherine held her gaze. Yes. Theo shifted against Serena's chest and made a sound, a small content sound, unbothered by the world. She put her hand on the back of his head. Does Reeves have enough to take this to the DA? She said. Not yet. We need to trace the first wire transfer. If it connects where I think it connects, Catherine stopped. Serena, if this goes where the evidence is pointing, your sister is not the main actor. She may have passed information. But whoever planned this, whoever arranged the payment, that's someone with more resources and more deliberate intent than passing information. The Hardings. Your stepfather's family, yes. They killed my mother to protect a financial arrangement. Catherine did not look away. That is what the evidence is suggesting. Lobby was quiet. The afternoon light came through the glass front at a low angle, the way October light does in Boston, thin and golden, and somehow accusatory. Serena thought about her mother working late on a Friday evening. Alone in the office, 11 days away from filing. Whatever she had been afraid of, she had kept working anyway. She had not stopped. She had not gone to the family. She had trusted the system, and the system had already been bought before she got there. Keep going, Serena said. Trace the first transfer. It will take another week, maybe 2. Fine. And Serena Damien Voss. Catherine's voice shifted slightly. His legal team filed a request this morning. Not adversarial. A formal request through my office to speak with you privately. He cited she checked a paper in her hand, a matter separate from the existing litigation. Serena looked at her. He knows about Theo, Serena said. I don't know what he knows. He saw the stroller. He did the math. She looked down at her son. He's not stupid. How do you want to handle it? She thought about Damien on the sidewalk with his hands in his pockets and the look in his eyes that was not what she had expected. She had expected anger or ownership or the specific flavor of masculine authority he had always operated from. She had expected him to try to claim something. He hadn't tried to claim anything. He had just looked at the stroller. I'll meet with him, she said. Not through his lawyers, in person, somewhere I choose. Catherine raised an eyebrow. Are you sure? No, Serena said honestly. But I'm going to do it anyway. She chose the law library at Boston University. It was a public building with multiple exits and enough ambiguity that the meeting had no quality of privacy intimacy, just 2 people at a table among other people at other tables, which was exactly what she wanted. She arrived 20 minutes early with Theo in the carrier against her chest, which was not something she had planned, but which she decided, arriving, to keep. If Damien had questions, having Theo present was its own answer. He arrived exactly on time. He was alone. He sat down across from her without the performance of being comfortable about it. He simply sat, and he looked at her, and then he looked at Theo in the carrier, and she watched his face do something involuntary that he couldn't fully control, the dark hair. Theo looked up at the new person with the focused assessment that was his default response to unfamiliar faces. His eyes, Damien said. Don't, Serena said. He stopped. I came here to tell you why I came back, she said. Not for you. Not for the litigation. I came back because I have reason to believe my mother's death was not an accident, and I intend to prove it. Damien went very still. The Harding family, she said. They had financial arrangements that my mother uncovered. She was going to report them. She died before she could. She kept her voice level, almost clinical, because the alternative was something she wasn't willing to perform in front of him. I have documentation. I have a financial investigator who is 3 weeks into the records. I have a wire transfer that connects to the city oversight board. Damien was quiet for a long moment. What do you need? He said. She studied him. The question had been simple and undecorated, and she sat with it for a moment, testing whether it was genuine or another version of positioning. Nothing from you, she said. I came to tell you myself because you're going to hear about it through other channels, and I didn't want the other channels to be first. Why does it matter which channel? Because my mother deserves to have her story told by someone who loved her, not passed around as information. Damien was quiet again. I'm sorry about Margaret, he said. She looked at him directly. Don't be sorry to me. Be sorry to her. He didn't have an answer for that. She stood, adjusting Theo in the carrier, and picked up her bag. If the Harding family becomes aware of what we've found, she said, things may move quickly. There are people with reasons to obstruct this who have the resources to try. I'm not asking for your help. I'm telling you this so that if something happens to obstruct it, if records disappear, if people become unavailable, you understand the landscape. She was at the edge of the table when he said Serena. She stopped. She didn't turn around. I know I don't have the right to ask. She waited. Is he mine? The library was quiet around them. Someone turned a page at another table. Somewhere above them, a clock on the wall marked the second. She turned back just enough to look at him. That conversation, she said, is not for today. She walked out through the main doors into the cold afternoon, and Theo patted her collarbone with one small hand, and she kept walking, and behind her, she could feel Damien at the table, with the weight of the question she hadn't answered settling into him like something he would carry for a long time before she decided what to do with it. 2 days later, Catherine called. The first wire transfer had been traced. It did not connect to the Hardings directly. It connected to a consulting account held in the name of Clairvale Serena's sister, registered 18 months before their mother died, Funded by a Harding family subsidiary and used for a single purpose, 3 payments to an individual who had been at the time employed as a records coordinator at the Boston Medical Examiner's office. Serena sat down. She sat at the kitchen table in the Cambridge apartment with Theo, playing on the floor, with his wooden train and the light coming through the maple outside the window, and she looked at the document Catherine had emailed, and she read it 3 times. Because the first time she read it, she could not make herself believe it, and the second time she read it, the shape of it became clear. And the third time she read it, she understood completely. Claire had not simply passed information. Claire had paid someone to alter what the medical examiner found, which meant the cardiac event that everyone had accepted as the cause of Margaret Vale's death had been arranged to look exactly like that. A cardiac event, a terrible coincidence, nothing requiring investigation, and Claire had funded the arrangement, and the Hardings had funded Claire, and the whole structure had been built and executed and lived with for 4 years, while Serena grieved her mother and rebuilt the firm, and married a man who didn't love her and lost everything and started over. While all of that was happening, the people who killed her mother had been at the other end of occasional texts and Christmas cards and a voicemail on her birthday that said, "Miss you, call when you can." She did not cry. She had cried enough in Slovenia on the terrace above the water for the version of this she had feared might be true. Now that it was confirmed, she did not need to cry. She needed to move. She picked up her phone and called Catherine and said, "Take it to the DA. Today. All of it." Catherine said, "Are you sure you're ready?" And Serena looked at her son on the floor, pushing his wooden train along a track he'd built from 2 books and a full towel, completely absorbed in the small engineering problem of keeping the wheels on the path. And she said, "I've been ready since the night of my wedding." Catherine filed at 4:17 on a Friday afternoon. Serena knew the exact time because she was sitting in the parking structure across from the DA's office when Catherine texted her. "Done. They're reviewing tonight. Expect contact Monday at the latest." Serena read the text twice, put the phone in her bag, and sat in the car for another 12 minutes without moving. Theo was at the apartment with a babysitter, a graduate student named Anna, who lived 2 floors up and had the particular gift of making 2-year-olds feel like their interests were genuinely the most important thing happening in any room. Serena had arranged for 4 hours. She had used 2 of them sitting in this parking structure doing nothing, which was the closest thing to rest she could manage. She drove back to Cambridge in the early evening with the radio off. The city moved around her traffic, pedestrians, the ordinary friction of a place that had no idea what had just been put in motion inside a government building 4 miles south. She stopped at a light on Massachusetts Avenue and watched a woman push a double stroller across the intersection and thought about her mother carrying the architecture firm through its first 3 years on nothing but the force of her own. Refusal to quit, and the light changed and she drove. That night, she put Theo to bed and sat at the kitchen table and wrote down everything she remembered about Claire from the year before their mother died. Not an accusation, not evidence, just memory organized chronologically, because she needed to understand the shape of what her sister had done and when the decision had been made and whether there had been a moment, a single moment, when Claire could have chosen differently and hadn't. She wrote for 2 hours. By the end, she had 4 pages and no clearer picture of her sister's interior than she'd had at the start. Claire had always been the one who managed surfaces. What happened underneath, in the machinery of her actual reasoning, Serena had never been able to fully access. She had attributed this to personality difference. Now she understood it differently. She folded the 4 pages and put them in her bag and went to bed. She did not sleep well. Monday came without contact from the DA's office. Catherine said this was normal. Serena said she understood. She spent Monday doing the kind of work that required attention, reviewing drawings for a small project she'd taken on remotely for a property owner in Somerville who was converting a former commercial space into residential units and needed an eye on the structural preservation questions. The work was detailed and absorbing and required her to think about load distribution and material integrity and the particular stubbornness of 19th century brick, which was exactly the kind of thinking that left no room for anything else. Theo spent Monday establishing a train route across the entire length of the apartment, which required negotiation over the coffee table's position and a formal protest when Serena moved a chair. She moved the chair back. Tuesday also passed without contact. Wednesday morning at 9:40, Catherine called. "They want a meeting," she said. Thursday. "They're bringing in someone from the financial crimes unit." "Is that good?" "It means they think there's something real to look at." There is something real to look at. I know that. Now they know it. Thursday at 10. Serena confirmed Thursday at 10 and ended the call and stood at the window with her coffee going cold in her hand, looking at the maple that had lost most of its leaves in the past week, the branches now bare against a white sky, and she felt the particular tension of something that had been set in motion and could not be recalled. Not fear, exactly. Something more like the feeling before a storm when the pressure drops and the air changes, and you understand that whatever is coming is already here, just not yet visible. The DA's office was on the 6th floor of a building that smelled of old carpet and printer toner and the specific institutional exhaustion of a place where difficult things were handled every day. The investigator from financial crimes was named Hartwell. She was somewhere in her mid-40s, compact and direct, with short gray hair and the quality of someone who had been doing this work long enough that nothing surprised her, but everything was still treated as though it mattered. She had a colleague with her, a younger man named Price, who took notes with careful efficiency, follow-up questions, and as follow-up questions suggested he had read the filing thoroughly before the meeting. Catherine sat beside Serena. On the table between them and Hartwell was Reeves's complete report, Catherine's filing, and a supplementary document that Reeves had submitted Sunday evening after 2 additional days of tracing a full map of the wire transfers, annotated with account identifications and dates, connecting the Harding family subsidiary to Claire's consulting account to the records coordinator at the medical examiner's office in a chain that was clean enough to follow and damning enough to be worth following. Hartwell reviewed it without expression. The records coordinator, she said. Do you know his current whereabouts? Reeves identified an address in Providence, Catherine said. He left the medical examiner's office 14 months after Margaret Vale's death. He's been working in private medical administration since. Has he been contacted? No. We wanted to bring this to you before any direct contact. Hartwell nodded. She looked at Serena. Your mother's death was ruled cardiac. Natural causes. The medical examiner at the time has since retired, Catherine said. He had no known connection to the Hardings. We believe the records coordinator acted independently, altered, or withheld specific findings before they reached the examiner. That's a significant allegation. Yes, Serena said. Hartwell looked at her steadily. Ms. Vale, I want to make sure you understand what we're dealing with here. If this documentation supports what it appears to support, we're looking at potential criminal charges across multiple parties. That process is not fast and it is not clean. It will become public at some point. Your sister's name will be in that public record. I understand. Your mother's death will be re-examined. That means an exhumation order is possible, depending on what the records show. Serena had known this was possible. She had thought about it on the terrace in Slovenia staring at the water. She had thought about her mother, who had hated being the subject of attention she hadn't chosen, who had always preferred the work to the recognition, and she had thought about what Margaret would want. She knew what Margaret would want. Do what the evidence requires, Serena said, whatever that is. Hartwell held her gaze for a moment, then wrote something on the pad in front of her. We'll need the original documentation from your investigator. We'll begin our own parallel review, and we'll need you to be available for follow-up. I'm not going anywhere, Serena said. The meeting ended at 11:40. She and Catherine walked out into the November air, and Catherine let the silence last half a block before she says, That went well. It went the way it needed to go, Serena said. Whether it went well depends on what they find. She went back to Cambridge and picked up Theo from Anna's apartment, and he came to the door with a crayon drawing of something that might have been a train or might have been a building, and he held it up with the confidence of someone presenting important work. It's excellent, she said. Bah, he agreed. She carried him downstairs with the drawing in her other hand and thought about Hartwell's face and the way she'd written on that pad, and she thought, it's started. Whatever comes next, it started. 3 days later, Claire called again. Serena was on a video call with the Somerville property owner, reviewing a revised floor plan, when her phone lit up on the desk beside her with Claire's name. She let it go to voicemail. She finished the call. She made a note about the load-bearing wall on the east side that the owner wanted to remove and which could not be removed without significant reinforcement that would cost 3 times what removing it was meant to save. Then she played Claire's voicemail. Serena, I need you to call me back. I know you've been talking to lawyers and investigators and I know what's happening. Please just call me before this goes somewhere we can't undo it. I need to explain something. There are things you don't know. Just please call me. The voicemail's 41 seconds long. Serena played it again. She listened to her sister's voice, the controlled quality cracking at the edges, the pleas coming out twice with a roughness that was either genuine fear or very good performance, and she thought about what Claire had said on the phone 2 weeks ago. She was my mother, too. She called Catherine instead of Claire. Claire left a voicemail, she said. She wants to explain something. She says there are things I don't know. Don't call her back without me present, Catherine said immediately. I know. If she's been contacted by the Hardings, if they know we've filed, she may be acting on instructions. Or she may be genuinely scared. Both can be true simultaneously, Catherine said. That doesn't change my advice. I know. I'll set up a meeting here. Neutral location. Can you be available Friday? Yes. She called Claire back. Claire answered on the first ring, which meant she'd been sitting with the phone. Serena Friday, Serena said. 2 o'clock, Catherine's office. If you want to explain something, that's where we do it. A pause. You want your lawyer there? Yes. That's Serena. This isn't a legal conversation. This is... Her voice was quiet and absolute. Friday at 2. Or we don't have the conversation at all. Claire was quiet. Okay, she said. Friday. Claire arrived at Catherine's office 11 minutes late. Serena had noticed over the years that Claire was never accidentally late. Lateness was a tool she used to enter rooms from a position of having been waited for, which gave her a slight psychological advantage in situations where she anticipated resistance. 11 minutes was calibrated enough to establish the dynamic without being rude enough to be called out on. Serena had always known this and had always let it pass without comment. She noted it now because she was done letting things pass. Claire looked different. Not dramatically, she was still composed, still put together, still the version of herself that she presented in professional settings. But there was something under the composure that hadn't been there before, a tightness around the eyes, a quality in the way she held her shoulders that suggested she had been holding them that way for days. She sat down across from Serena and Catherine and put her hands flat on the table. I need to tell you what actually happened, she said. Go ahead, Serena said. Claire looked at Catherine. Does she have to be here? Yes, Serena and Catherine said simultaneously. Claire's jaw tightened. She looked back at Serena. I didn't know what they were going to do, she said. I need you to understand that. What I did, what I agreed to do, I thought it was going to stop at the financial piece. I thought we were just going to make sure Mom's complaint went nowhere, that she'd file, it would be reviewed, it would be quietly dismissed, and the whole thing would go away. Serena was very still. You thought you were just going to make her complaint disappear. Yes. And that seemed acceptable to you. Claire's eyes moved away, then back. The Hardings had a lot of pressure on me. The consulting arrangement, I had debts, Serena, debts you didn't know about, and they offered to clear them in exchange for your mother's complaint, for information about what she was planning and when she was going to file. That's all I agreed to. Information. And the payments to the records coordinator at the medical examiner's office? Claire's hands, flat on the table, pressed harder against the surface. That wasn't me. Your account, Claire. The account was mine, but I didn't authorize that payment. I didn't know it was happening until after. Her voice cracked on the last word and she steadied it visibly, by effort. When Mom died and I figured out what the payment had been, for what they'd actually done, I didn't know what to do. I had already been paid. I was already in it. If I went to the police, I was exposing myself, and they knew that. The Hardings knew that. And they made very sure I understood that what I'd done, the information I'd passed, was enough to make me complicit, regardless of what I'd intended. The room was very quiet. Serena looked at her sister. She looked at the tightness around Claire's eyes and the hands pressing flat against the table, and the way Claire was holding her breath, waiting for a response, and she thought about the 41-second voicemail and the pleas that had come out twice, and she asked herself the question she had been asking herself for weeks. Is this real, or is this a position? She couldn't tell. That was the truth. She could not tell. You passed information that allowed them to intercept her complaint, Serena said. Whether or not you authorized the second payment, you gave them the timing. You gave them the window. I know that. She died 11 days before she was going to file. You gave them 11 days. Claire closed her eyes. When she opened them, they were wet, but she was not crying, not yet, in the way of someone who had used up most of their grief in private, before this conversation and was running low. I know. Why are you telling me this now? Because the Hardings know about your filing. They know about the investigator and the wire transfers and all of it, and they are... She stopped. Her voice changed register, dropped into something more urgent. Serena, these are not people who respond to legal exposure by waiting for a trial. They have been managing this for 4 years. They have resources, and they have lawyers, and they have people who do things that lawyers don't do. And I'm scared. You're scared for yourself, yes. And for you. She leaned forward slightly. They know you have a child. They know you're back. And the person who handles these situations for the Hardings is not someone who... She stopped again. Who what? Serena said. Who sees a child as off limits. The sentence landed in the room and sat there. Serena felt something go cold and precise in her chest, the way a temperature drop is felt first in the extremities. She did not move. She did not change her expression. She held Claire's gaze and waited for her own instincts to catch up with the information. Who is this person, she said. I don't know his name. I've never met him directly, but I know what he's done before. In other situations where the Hardings had exposure that needed to go away. Claire's voice was very flat now, the emotion stripped out of it by the information she was delivering. He doesn't threaten people. He just makes things complicated. Documents disappear. Witnesses become unreliable. People who were going to testify, they have other priorities. And if that doesn't work? Claire looked at her without answering. Serena turned to Catherine. Can we get an emergency protective order? On what grounds? On the grounds that a witness in an active DA investigation has communicated a credible threat to the investigated parties and their dependents. Catherine was already writing. It's possible. It requires documenting today's conversation. Document it. Serena looked back at Claire. I need you to put everything you've told me in writing, with dates, amounts, names of everyone at the Hardings who was involved. Everything. Claire stared at her. If I do that. If you do that, Serena said, you have a chance of being the person who cooperated rather than the person who was caught. Catherine can advise you on what that means legally. She paused. But I need it in writing, Claire. Not a conversation. Documentation. Serena, they'll know I talked. They already know you talked. You called me. You came here. Serena's voice did not soften. There is no version of this where you stay on the side you've been on and come out safe. There's only the question of which side you're on when it ends. Claire looked at the table. She looked at her own hands. She looked for a moment, like someone much younger, someone standing at a branching point that they understood. Finally, they could not avoid choosing. I need a lawyer, she said quietly. Yes, Catherine said. You do, and I'd recommend getting one today. Claire left at 3:40. Serena sat in Catherine's office for another 20 minutes after she was gone, not saying anything useful, just existing in the space left by the conversation. Catherine made tea that neither of them drank. Outside the window, the November afternoon was already darkening, the sky gone the color of old pewter over the rooftops. Do you believe her? Catherine said. About not authorizing the medical examiner payment? I don't know. About being scared? Yes. Serena wrapped both hands around the mug without drinking. She's been carrying this for 4 years. That's a long time to carry something that heavy. It doesn't make her innocent, no, but it might make her useful. Serena set the mug down. If she documents everything and the Hardings have a credible threat against us, against Theo, then Hartwell has everything she needs to move faster. The protective order, start it today. Whatever I need to sign, I'll sign. She drove back to Cambridge in the dark, early evening traffic thick on the bridge, the river below holding the last of the gray light. She thought about what Claire had said, he doesn't see a child as off limits, and she let herself feel the fear that came with it, fully and completely for the length of the bridge. She did not try to manage it or diminish it. She felt it and noted it and used it to clarify her thinking. She was afraid. That was real. She was also not going to let it stop her. That was also real. She picked up Theo from Anna's apartment and carried him downstairs and gave him dinner and read him a book about a bear who could not find his hat, which they had read 47 times, and which retained its power each time because Theo found the ending the bear had been wearing the hat, the whole time reliably satisfying. Hat, Theo said, pointing. Hat, she confirmed. She put him to bed and went back to the kitchen table and opened her laptop and began writing a detailed account of Claire's statement dates, amounts, the exact phrasing of the threat, the description of the unnamed individual who handled the Hardings' exposure problems. She wrote for 90 minutes. She sent it to Catherine at 10:15. Then her phone rang. Unknown number, Boston area code. She answered it. Ms. Vale. The voice was male, middle-aged, neither warm nor threatening the voice of someone who had learned to speak in a register that communicated nothing and implied everything. I'd like to discuss a matter of mutual interest. Who is this? Someone who thinks you should understand the full picture before you continue in your current direction. She set her jaw. If you'd like to speak to me, contact my lawyer. I think you'll want to hear this before your lawyer does. A brief pause, calibrated. We know about the boy, Ms. Vale. We know about his father. And we think Damien Voss would be very interested to learn that he has a son, particularly if that information came from us rather than from you." Her hand on the phone was completely steady. Her heart was not. "We're not asking for much," the voice continued. "We'd simply like the filing to be withdrawn. The investigator's report returned to us. And your very understandable decision to relocate again somewhere quieter. You've done it before. You're clearly capable." She didn't say anything. "Ms. Vale, you're a practical woman. You built a life out of very little in very difficult circumstances. That's admirable. What we're suggesting is simply that you continue building it elsewhere, quietly, without this particular complication. Your son gets a stable life. You keep your secret. Everyone moves forward. And my mother?" A pause, shorter than the previous ones. "Your mother made a decision to pursue a course of action that had significant consequences. That was her choice." The cold precision in Serena's chest sharpened to a point. "You're threatening my child," she said. "And you're threatening to expose his father's identity, which you think I've been hiding as leverage, to make me abandon an investigation into my mother's death." "I'm presenting options," the voice said. "The first option is more comfortable for everyone." "What's the second option?" Another pause. "More complicated." "For whom?" "For you," the voice said. "Primarily." She was quiet for a moment. "I need 24 hours, she said. "Of course, that's reasonable." The voice had a quality of satisfaction that it did not try to hide. "We'll speak tomorrow." The call ended. She put the phone down on the table and looked at it. 24 hours. They had given her 24 hours to decide whether to abandon her mother's case or let them destroy what she had spent 3 years protecting the secret of Theo's parentage, the wall between her son and the world of Damien Voss. She had 24 hours. And she had been wrong about one thing she understood now. She had believed that the greatest risk in coming back to Boston was facing Damien. She had managed her re-entry around him, the sidewalk, the library, the careful distance. She had been watching the wrong direction. The Hardings had been watching her come back. They had been watching her whole time. And in 24 hours, if she didn't give them what they wanted, they would go to Damien Voss and tell him he had a son. And whatever control she had over that conversation, the timing, the setting, her terms, her words would be gone completely. She stood up from the table. She picked up her phone. She called Damien. He answered in 2 rings, which meant he'd been waiting, and she didn't give him the chance to say anything before she said, "I need to see you. Tonight. Can you come to Cambridge?" A silence. "Yes," he said. Alone, yes. She gave him the address and ended the call and stood in the kitchen of the Cambridge apartment with Theo, asleep in the next room, and the night pressing against the windows and the understanding settling into her bones that the conversation she had been preparing to have on her own terms, in her own time, when she was ready, was going to happen in the next hour because someone had taken the choice away from her. She had one move left that was entirely her own. She had to make it before they made it for her. Damien arrived in 40 minutes. She heard the car on the street below before she heard the knock-a-door closing, with the particular weight of a vehicle that costs more than most people's houses, then footsteps on the stairs that she recognized without being able to say how she recognized them, only that she did. 3 years and she still knew the rhythm of the man's walk. She opened the door before he knocked. He looked at her face, and whatever he had prepared to say to us when she opened the door, he didn't say it. He read her expression the way she had apparently always been reading his, with more accuracy than she'd given him credit for. Or maybe he had learned to read her better in the years she'd been gone, the way you sometimes understand something more clearly from a distance than you ever did up close. "What happened?" he said. She stepped back from the door. He came in. The apartment was small and warm and had the organized quality of a space that a person had functional rather than decorative books stacked on the counter. Theo's train on the floor near the hallway, a coat hanging on the back of a chair that was too small to be the right place for a coat, but was where it always ended up anyway. Damien looked at the train. He looked at the coat. He looked at the drawing on the refrigerator, Theo's crayon rendering, of something that might have been a train or might have been a building, and his jaw moved slightly. "Sit down," she said. He sat at the kitchen table. She remained standing because she needed the physical fact of being upright to get through what she was about to say. "I'm going to tell you something," she said. "I was going to tell you differently. I had a plan for how and when and what I would say, and I had been working toward it on my own timeline. That timeline ended about an hour ago." He was very still. "Someone called me tonight. Connected to the Harding family, my stepfather's people. The investigation I've been running into my mother's death has created exposure for them, and they want it stopped. And they told me that if I don't withdraw the filing and pull the investigator's report, they will go to you and tell you that you have a son. Damien did not move. He sat at her kitchen table in his coat that she didn't recognize, and he did not move and he did not speak, and the apartment was so quiet she could hear the heat in the pipes, and, from the back bedroom, the small, even sounds of Theo breathing in his sleep. So I'm telling you myself, she said, before they do, because that was the only move I had left that was mine. She watched him process it. She watched it move through him the way a physical impact moves through a body, the initial contact, then the spread of it, then the full understanding of the damage. His hands were on the table in front of him, and she watched his knuckles go from normal to white to normal again in the space of 10 seconds. Theo, he said, yes. He's mine, yes. He looked at the refrigerator, at the drawing. He looked at it for a long time. How old, he said. His voice was strange, stripped down to almost nothing, the constructed authority completely absent. 2 years and 4 months. She watched him do the math. She watched the math complete itself. He put both hands over his face. He held them there for a moment, then brought them down and set them flat on the table and looked at the surface of the table as though it were the only stable thing in the room. Why didn't you tell me? She had prepared for this question. She had prepared an answer that was honest and measured and accounted for the complexity. What came out instead was simpler. Because on the night of our wedding, I found out who you were, she said, and I didn't know which version of you would come looking for him. He didn't argue with this. That was, she thought, the first honest thing he had ever given her, the absence of an argument where he could have made one. What do the Harding people want, he said. His voice had changed register again. The stripped-down quality was still there, but something else had come in underneath it. Something harder. Withdrawal of the DA filing. The investigator report turned over to them. And me gone again somewhere quiet, somewhere distant. They want you to disappear. Yes. And if you don't, they come to you. They use the information about Theo as pressure they assume that having you involved on their terms, with the element of surprise, will create enough chaos in my life that the investigation collapses. Damien was quiet for a moment. They assume I'd be chaos, he said. They assume you'd react like the man you were 3 years ago. He looked at her directly. Would they be wrong? She held his gaze. I don't know yet. That's partly why I'm telling you now instead of making a different decision. He sat with this. She could see him working through it, the situation, the exposure, what the Hardings knew, and how they knew it, and what it meant that they had been watching her closely enough to identify Theo's parentage. How did they find out about him, he said. I don't know exactly. Probably through whatever surveillance they had on me once I filed. A photograph, a background check, a public record from Slovenia. Theo's birth certificate lists both parents. It lists me? I had no reason at the time to think you'd ever see it. He absorbed this. But they found it, yes. He stood up. He wasn't a man who sat still when he was thinking through something that required action. She remembered that the way he processed by moving, pacing, the physical expression of a mind running hard. He moved to the window and stood with his back to her, looking at the dark street below. What does your lawyer say? I called Catherine after I called you. She's filing for an emergency protective order in the morning based on the threat to Theo. But a protective order takes time to process, and it doesn't stop someone from making a phone call to you tonight or tomorrow. They won't make that call now, he said. They gave you 24 hours, which means they expect me to use the 24 hours to decide to comply. He turned around. And will you? She looked at him steadily. No. Something moved through his expression, not surprise. Something closer to confirmation. Then I need to know who made the call, he said. The person who called you. The person they use for these situations. Why? Because I need to make sure they understand that the calculation changed the moment they involved my son. She felt something shift in the room, not threatening, not directed at her, but a very particular quality of attention that she had heard about from people who dealt with Damien Voss professionally and had described it afterward as the moment you understood that the man was not performing. That the control was not a performance of control, but the actual thing. And underneath it was something with weight and consequence. Damien, she kept her voice even. This goes through the DA's office. I know how it goes through the DA's office, he said. I'm not talking about interfering with the investigation. I'm talking about making sure the people who threatened a 2-year-old understand that doing so was a mistake. That's not Serena. He said her name the way he had on the sidewalk outside Catherine's office, not as a summons, not as a claim. Just the name. Let me do something. She looked at him. She thought about what he was and what he'd done and the way he'd looked at the drawing, on the refrigerator, and she thought about the man who had sat at this table 2 minutes ago with his hands over his face, and she thought about her mother working alone in an office, 11 days before she was going to do the right thing, and nobody came to help her. "The person who called me," she said. "I don't have a name." What exactly did he say? She repeated it, as precisely as she could, the phrasing, the cadence, the specific words about Theo. Damien listened without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "That's Mercer," he said. She stared at him. "You know him?" "I know who he is. He works private contracts across 3 or 4 major Boston families. He's not Harding directly, he's insulated. They hire him so there's distance." He paused. "He's been in this business for 15 years. He knows where the lines are. He told me my son wasn't off limits. He told you that to scare you." Damien's voice was flat. "It's his opening position. He pushes until he finds where your fear is, and then he lives there." He paused again. "But that assessment only holds if you don't have someone willing to push back. And you're willing to push back." He looked at her with an expression that was not quite what she had expected from this conversation. There was no ownership in it. No reclamation. Something more stripped than that, a man looking at a situation he had created partly through his own failures and deciding what he owed. "He threatens my son," Damien said simply. "Yes, I'm willing to push back." She didn't sleep. She sat at the kitchen table. After Damien left, he'd been there for just under 2 hours, most of which had been strategic rather than personal, which was the right way to use him in this moment, even if it wasn't the conversation she had eventually been preparing to have, and she went through the filing in her head. Every document, every piece of evidence Reeves had assembled, every wire transfer and date and account number. The Hardings had resources. They had Mercer. They had 4 years of practice managing this specific exposure. They had Claire, who was compromised enough to be unpredictable. What Serena had, Catherine Hartwell, a DA's office that had been handed a documented trail of financial conspiracy and potential homicide, and now Damien Voss, who was whatever else he was, the kind of man that someone like Mercer would have to recalculate around. She thought about whether using Damien was the right decision. She thought about it for 40 minutes and arrived at an answer she could live with. She hadn't used him. She had told him the truth about his son, because the alternative was letting someone else tell him, on their terms, as a weapon. She had told him first. What he did with it was his decision. She hadn't asked him for anything except the meeting. That he had volunteered to push back was his choice. She went to bed at 2 in the morning and lay in the dark and listened to Theo's breathing through the wall and thought about her mother. She thought about Margaret working late on a Friday in March alone, with the documentation ready, 11 days from filing. She thought about whether her mother had been afraid in those 11 days, and whether she'd had anyone to tell her fear to, or whether she'd carried it by herself the way she'd always carried things, with the particular upright quality of a woman, who had decided that the alternative to carrying it was putting it down, and putting it down meant losing, and losing was not an option she had made available to herself. Serena understood this. She understood it the way you understand something that was demonstrated to you before you had language for it, so that by the time you could name it, it was already part of your structure. She fell asleep just before 3. At 7:15, Catherine called. Serena answered before the second ring, already awake, already sitting up. "The Hardings filed an emergency motion this morning to block the DA's review," Catherine said. Her voice had the clipped quality of someone who had been awake for a while, managing something fast-moving. "Their legal team is arguing that Reeves's investigative methodology constitutes unauthorized access to protected financial records, and that the filing should be dismissed on procedural grounds." Serena got out of bed. Can they win that motion? It will be heard this afternoon. The judge assigned is Caldwell. She's thorough, and she doesn't like procedural games. But if their argument has any merit, she'll have to consider it. "Hartwell called me at 6:45. She wants you in the DA's office by 9. I'll be there." She dressed in the dark so she didn't wake Theo. She texted Anna, "Emergency, can you take Theo from 8? I'll explain later." Anna responded in 3 minutes with a thumbs up. Serena got Theo up, fed him toast and half a banana, handed him the wooden train, and carried him upstairs to Anna's apartment at 7:50 with a bag of his things and the particular guilt of a parent who needs to be somewhere else. "Truck?" Theo said to Anna hopefully. Anna produced a toy truck from a basket by the door. Serena kissed Theo on the top of the head and went back downstairs. Hartwell was already at the conference table when Serena arrived at 9:03 with Catherine beside her. Price was there too, and a third person Serena Didn't recognize a woman in her 50s with reading glasses and a legal pad who was introduced as Sanders from the DA's senior staff. The energy in the room was different from the first meeting, tighter, faster, with the quality of people who had been moving quickly since early morning and were operating on the particular focus that comes from knowing the window is narrow. The motion is being heard at 2, Hartwell said without preamble. Their argument is that your investigator accessed financial records through a chain of custody that they're characterizing as irregular. We believe the argument is weak, but it will take time to defeat, and time is what they're buying. Mercer called me last night, Serena said. Hartwell looked at her. He gave me 24 hours to withdraw the filing. His leverage was private information about my son's parentage. She said this carefully and without visible affect. I declined to comply. I wanted on record that the threat was made and that I refused. Hartwell and Sanders exchanged a look. Sanders wrote something. Can you describe the call in detail, Price said. She described it, same precision she'd used with Damien, the phrasing, the cadence, the specific reference to Theo. Price wrote quickly. Hartwell listened without expression. Mercer, Hartwell said when she finished. First name? I don't know. Damien Voss identified him by the description. Another exchange between Hartwell and Sanders. You contacted Voss? Hartwell said. I informed him of the threat to his son, yes. He's Theo's father. He had a right to know, and I had a strategic reason to tell him before Mercer did. She kept her voice even. He's not involved in the investigation. He's aware of it. What did he say he intended to do? He said he would make clear to Mercer that threatening his son was a miscalculation. I didn't ask him to do that, and I didn't agree to anything in exchange. He volunteered it independently. Hartwell leaned back slightly. Ms. Vale, if Voss takes action against Mercer that fears with... I understand the concern, Serena said. I don't control what Damien Voss does. I can only tell you what I know and what my own actions were. Sanders put down her pen. The motion this afternoon, regardless of outcome, it signals that the Hardings are moving to shut this down fast, which means either they have more exposure than we've found, or they're more scared than they should be given what we have. Both possibilities suggest we should accelerate. Accelerate how? Catherine said. The records coordinator in Providence. Reeves identified him. We haven't contacted him yet. If we get to him today before the Hardings do... They may already know you've identified him, Serena said. Yes, Hartwell said, which is why Price is driving to Providence, and she checked her watch 40 minutes. The motion hearing lasted 3 hours. Serena was not present. She was not a party to the procedural argument, which was between the Hardings lawyers and the DA's office and the judge, a controlled and technical exchange that Catherine attended and described afterward in the particular language of someone reporting a battle she had watched from the edge of rather than fought in. She sat in the waiting area of the DA's building and made herself eat a sandwich she'd bought from a cart outside and checked her phone at intervals she was trying to keep to 10 minutes, but which were actually closer to 4. At 12:40, Damien texted, Mercer is aware the 24 hours is not going to produce what he asked for. He knows I'm involved. He'll recalculate. She stared at the text. What did you do? She typed. The response came back in 30 seconds. Talk to him. That's all. He's not stupid enough to escalate against me directly, and he knows it. The Hardings are his client, not his cause. He works for money, and right now the math on this job is getting worse. She put the phone in her pocket. She thought about what talk to him meant coming from Damien Voss, and she decided she wasn't going to think about it further. She had one investigation, and it was the one Hartwell was running. At 2:17, Catherine texted, motion denied. Caldwell ruled the investigative methodology was sound. We're clear to proceed. Serena let out a breath she had been holding for 6 hours. Then at 2:53, Price called Hartwell directly. Serena knew something had happened because Hartwell came out of the conference room where she'd been working and walked past the waiting area without looking at anyone and went into a different office and closed the door. And the quality of the building shifted slightly in the way buildings do when something that changes the shape of a situation has just been communicated. Catherine came out 4 minutes later. She sat down next to Serena. Price found the records coordinator, she said, and he talked. He's been waiting for someone to come to him. He's had 4 years of understanding what he did and why he did it, and exactly how much trouble he's in when it surfaces. He gave Price everything. The specific findings he altered. The payment, the contact at the Hardings. Catherine paused. And something else. Serena waited. The Hardings had a second arrangement, Catherine said, beyond the payment to the records coordinator. A conversation before Margaret died with someone who had pharmaceutical access. A specific compound, undetectable in a standard autopsy. Catherine's voice was very careful and very precise. Your mother's death was not an opportunistic decision. They had been planning it for at least 6 weeks before she died. The waiting area was quiet around them. 6 weeks before Margaret died, Serena had been in New York for a professional conference. She had called her mother from a hotel room and complained about the catering and made her mother laugh, and her mother had said, "Come home soon. I miss your face." And Serena had said 2 more days, "I'll bring you that pastry you like from the airport." And she had brought it, and her mother had been alive and had eaten the pastry and said it was too sweet and eaten it anyway. 6 weeks before that, someone had already decided she was going to die. They planned it, Serena said, yes. They planned it while she was still working. While she was still stopped, yes. Serena put both hands flat on her own thighs. She pressed them there. She felt the fabric of her pants under her palms and the solid fact of her own knees, and she used these to stay in the room rather than going somewhere she couldn't come back from quickly. Does Price have it documented? She said. He's recording the interview now with the coordinator's consent. Full cooperation. The coordinator wants a deal. Price has a prosecutor on the phone. Is it enough for the Hardings, combined with everything else we have? Catherine hesitated. Yes, I think it's enough. Serena nodded. She stood up. Where are you going? Catherine said. I need air. She went downstairs and out through the glass doors into the November afternoon. The air was cold and sharp and smelled of car exhaust and old leaves, which was the smell of Boston in November, which was the smell of her childhood in a city that her mother had built a career in and raised her in and refused to leave even when the work was hard. She stood on the sidewalk. She thought about Margaret Vale, 61 years old, working alone in her office on a Friday evening with the documentation ready and 11 days to go and a certainty in her that the right thing to do was the right thing to do regardless of the cost, and someone had calculated the cost on her behalf and decided to collect it early. She was not going to cry on this sidewalk. She was not going to do anything on this sidewalk except breathe the cold air and let her hands unclench and understand, fully, that the thing she had come back to do was going to be done. Her phone buzzed, unknown number, Boston area code. Different number from last night, but the same silence on the line for 1 second before the voice came on. And it wasn't Mercer. It was a woman. Ms. Vale. The voice was older, controlled with the particular quality of someone who had been managing people from a position of authority for decades. My name is Eleanor Harding. I believe we should meet. Serena stood on the sidewalk with the November air cold against her face and said nothing. I'm prepared to discuss a resolution that serves everyone's interests, Eleanor Harding said, including yours, including your mother's. My mother doesn't have interests anymore, Serena said. You made sure of that. A silence. Ms. Vale. You're a practical woman. I've observed you carefully over the past several weeks, and I believe you understand that what you want is accountability, not destruction. What you're offering, Serena said, is the same thing Mercer offered me last night. A way out. For you. She paused. I already answered that question. The situation has changed since last night. Yes, Serena said. It has. Your records coordinator spent the last 2 hours talking to a prosecutor in Providence. So the situation has changed, but not in the direction you think. The silence that followed was different from the previous ones. I see, Eleanor Harding said. I imagine you do. Another silence. Then I suppose we'll handle this in court, Eleanor said. The control was still there, but something underneath it had shifted. The way a wall sounds different once you know it's not load-bearing. Yes, Serena said. We will. She ended the call. She stood on the sidewalk for another moment. Then she went back inside to tell Hartwell about the call, because everything was evidence now, and she understood the shape of this well enough to know that Eleanor Harding, calling her directly, from a traceable number, in the hour after her records coordinator started cooperating, was either a desperate move or a trap, and she needed Hartwell to tell her which. She pushed through the glass doors. Across the lobby, the elevator opened. Damien stepped out. He was not alone. He had a man with him she didn't recognize, heavy-set, with the quality of someone used to standing slightly behind other people. But Damien moved ahead of the man and crossed the lobby and reached her before she could reconfigure the situation in her mind fast enough to respond to it. Mercer is done, he said quietly. He withdrew from the contract an hour ago. The Hardings have no external management now. She stared at him. I told you I'd talk to him. What did you say? Damien looked at her steadily. I told him the truth. That this investigation is going forward, that the DA is involved, that his client is facing criminal exposure, and that anyone who acts against you or Theo or anyone connected to this case will be identified and held personally responsible. He paused, and I told him that I have a 2-year-old son, and I'm not the kind of man who lets threats against his child go without consequence. She held his gaze. You told him you're Theo's father, she said. Yes. She thought about what that meant that Damien had voluntarily, in a conversation with a man like Mercer, claimed his son. Not as leverage, not as a position. As a fact about himself that he was willing to stand behind. The Hardings called me, she said. Eleanor Harding. Directly, just now. His jaw tightened. What did she say? She wanted a meeting. I told her the records coordinator was cooperating. She said we'd handle it in court. She's cutting Mercer loose and going defensive. He nodded slightly. That's what happens when the external layer collapses. They pull back to legal defense. Hartwell needs to know about the call. Then let's go tell her. She looked at him. She looked at the man who had betrayed her on the night of their wedding and who had spent 3 years not finding her because she'd been careful and because some part of him had perhaps not pushed as hard as he could have, because he understood, on some level he wouldn't examine, that what he'd done had earned him the disappearance, and who was standing in the lobby of the DA's building having told a man like Mercer that he was Theo's father because the alternative was letting a threat against his son go unanswered. Don't make this into something it isn't, she said quietly. You being here, it helps, I know that. But this isn't a reconciliation. This isn't— I know what it is, he said. It's a 2-year-old who deserves to grow up without people like Mercer in his orbit. That's what it is. She held his gaze for a moment longer. Then she turned toward the elevator. He walked beside her, and behind them both, through the glass doors, the November afternoon pressed cold against the building, and upstairs in a conference room on the 6th floor, Hartwell was already on the phone with the prosecutor in Providence. And the records coordinator was still talking. And 4 years of careful concealment were coming apart under the weight of their own architecture, and in a sublet apartment in Cambridge, a 2-year-old boy was pushing a wooden train across the floor in the care of a graduate student who had no idea what was being decided, on his behalf, in a building 4 miles south. Serena pressed the elevator button. Her hand was steady. Her heart was not. It was running hard and fast the way it runs, when you are very afraid and very certain simultaneously. When you have passed the point where turning back is possible and the only direction that remains is through, and she had passed that point on the night she made the call to the DA, or perhaps earlier, on the night she called Damien to tell him about his son, or perhaps earlier still, on a terrace in Slovenia above the water, when she had let herself understand that her mother's death had been decided by people who had calculated the cost of a woman's life against the cost of exposure and found the math acceptable. The elevator opened. She stepped in. Damien stepped in beside her. The doors closed. And in the space of silence between the lobby and the 6th floor, with 4 years of evidence in a folder upstairs, and a man who had failed her, standing 2 feet to her left, and her son's wooden train on the floor of an apartment across the city, she understood that whatever came next was going to require the last thing she had been holding, in reserve not patience, not strategy, not the careful management of information and timing that had gotten her this far. What came next was going to require her to trust someone. The question was whether it was going to be Damien, or the system, or herself, and whether any of those 3 things were ready to hold the weight she was about to put on them. The elevator reached the 6th floor. The doors opened. Hartwell was in the hallway, already moving toward them, with a look on her face that meant the call with Providence had produced something. And whatever it was, it had changed the timeline, and Serena stepped out of the elevator into whatever was about to happen next, with her shoulders level and her jaw set, and the full weight of everything she had survived pressed down into her feet against the floor. Hartwell said, "The coordinator gave us a name." She was moving as she said it, already turning back toward the conference room, expecting them to follow. They followed. Damien stayed 2 steps behind Serena in the hallway, with the quality of someone who understood he was present on sufferance and was being careful about the space he occupied. Price was on a laptop at the conference table. Sanders was standing with her arms crossed and her reading glasses pushed up on her head, which Serena had learned in the past week meant she was thinking rather than reading. "The pharmaceutical contact," Hartwell said, sitting down. "The compound the coordinator described, the one used on your mother." The coordinator knew the supplier's name. A man named Dalton Hess. He's been on our radar in a different context for 2 years. Licensed pharmacist, operates a compounding lab outside Worcester, has a history of filling orders that don't appear in standard tracking systems. Can you connect him to the Hardings? Catherine said. We already did. 30 minutes ago. Hartwell turned the laptop so they could see the screen of financial record, transaction detail, dates. 2 payments from the Harding subsidiary to an LLC connected to Hess. The second payment was made 9 days before Margaret Vale died. The room was quiet 9 days. Serena looked at the dates on the screen and did the arithmetic without wanting to, and arrived at the same place she always arrived, which was the last phone call from the hotel in New York. Her mother's voice saying, "Come home soon, I miss your face," and the pastry from the airport, and the fact that someone had already been paid, and the compound had already been prepared, and all of it had already been decided. "What do you need from me?" she said. "Your statement on the Mercer call is already documented. Eleanor Harding's call to you this afternoon, we need that on record as well." Hartwell paused. "And we're going to move on arrests. Not today, tomorrow morning, early. We want everything locked before the Hardings have time to respond to the coordinator's cooperation." "How many arrests?" Eleanor Harding. Her son? Richard, he was the signatory on the subsidiary payments. "The records coordinator is cooperating, so he'll be processed separately under whatever the prosecutor in Providence arranges. Dalton Hess, pending confirmation of the pharmaceutical connection." Hartwell looked at her. In Claire Vale, Serena had known this was coming. She had known it since the moment Catherine showed her the wire transfers with Claire's account name on them. Knowing it was coming did not make the word land with any less weight. "What's the charge against Claire?" Catherine said. "Conspiracy. Potentially accessory. The DA will determine the full scope based on the statement she provides. If she cooperates fully, the exposure reduces significantly. If she doesn't, Hartwell let the sentence complete itself." "She was going to get a lawyer," Serena said. "I told her to get one Friday." "Did she?" "I don't know." Hartwell looked at Price. Price was already on his phone. The arrests happened at 6:15 the following morning. Serena knew this because Hartwell texted her at 6:22 executed. All primary targets in custody. Claire Vale surrendered voluntarily with counsel present. She read the text in the kitchen, standing in the dark before Theo woke up. The apartment was completely quiet. Outside, the November morning was still black, the maple just visible as a dark shape against the darker sky. Surrendered voluntarily, Claire had gotten a lawyer. The lawyer had advised cooperation. Whatever Claire's reasons, fear, guilt, the particular exhaustion of carrying something for 4 years, she had walked in voluntarily, and that fact contained something that Serena was not ready to name yet. She put the phone on the counter and made coffee and stood at the window and waited for the sky to change. It changed slowly, the way November mornings do in Boston, grudgingly, the dark thinning to gray, and then to the particular pale light of a cold, clear day. By the time Theo made the sounds that indicated imminent waking, the maple outside was visible in full bare branches against a white sky, and Serena had been standing at the window for 40 minutes and had thought about her mother for most of them. Not grief, exactly. Something past grief, the way a landscape looks after a storm when the damage is fully visible, and you understand what was lost and what held. She went to get Theo. He was sitting up in his crib with the wooden train, which he had apparently retrieved from the floor at some point in the night and brought to bed, which was not a new development, but which she had not caught him doing before. He held it up when she came in with the expression of someone presenting a reasonable explanation for their choices. "Train," he said. "Train," she agreed. She picked him up. He pressed his face against her neck for a moment, the good morning weight of him, warm and solid and entirely present, and then pulled back to look at her with the focused assessment that was his default mode. "Breakfast," he said. "Yes," she said, "breakfast." The Harding arraignment was covered by 2 local news outlets and 1 national wire service. Serena read the coverage on her laptop at the kitchen table while Theo ate oatmeal and conducted a parallel investigation into whether the wooden train could be incorporated into the oatmeal without adult intervention. The answer, she established through active monitoring, was no. The coverage was accurate and incomplete in the way that early coverage always is. It had the names, the charges, the broad shape of the conspiracy without the texture of it. It didn't have the terrace in Slovenia or the hotel room in New York or a woman working alone in her office in March with 11 days left and no idea. It had conspiracy and financial fraud, and the word allegedly applied to everything as required by law. It had Claire's name. Serena looked at her sister's name in print and felt something complicated move through her that she didn't try to analyze. She closed the laptop. Catherine called at 9. "Richard Harding's lawyer is already talking plea negotiation," she said. "Eleanor is not. She's going full defense, which her lawyers are entitled to do. and which will take 18 months at minimum. The DA is confident in the evidence. And Claire? Her lawyer spoke to the prosecutor this morning. She's providing a full statement. The charges against her will be reduced based on cooperation. The prosecutor is looking at accessory after the fact rather than conspiracy, depending on the scope of what she knew in advance. Catherine paused. She's also asked to speak to you. Serena was quiet. You don't have to, Catherine said. There's no legal obligation. I know. Do you want to? She thought about Claire saying she was my mother too in the stripped-down voice. She thought about whether that had been genuine. She had been unable to tell in the moment, and she was still unable to tell, which might mean the performance had been good or might mean the grief had been real. And the two things, the grief and the complicity, had existed in Claire simultaneously, which was its own kind of unbearable to consider. Not yet, Serena said. Tell her lawyer I'll consider it. Not yet. She met Damien at a park outside Cambridge 10 days after the arrests. It was her suggestion. She had picked the location deliberately open, public, with a playground at one end, where Theo could operate independently for stretches of time without needing management, which meant the conversation could be had in pieces with natural interruptions built in. She had found, in the past year, that conversations broken up by a toddler's demands were sometimes easier than conversations that had to be sustained continuously, because the interruptions prevented the kind of sustained emotional pressure that made people say things they hadn't fully thought through. Damien was there before her. He was standing near the playground entrance with his hands in his coat pockets. A different coat again, she noticed, gray this time, and he looked at her when she came through the gate, and then looked at Theo's stroller in with the expression that he'd been wearing since the kitchen table in Cambridge. The expression of someone recalibrating the world around a new and central fact. She let Theo out of the stroller. He immediately moved toward the playground with the purposeful efficiency of someone who had been planning this since the stroller was locked. Slide, he announced. Slide, she confirmed. She and Damien walked to a bench near the climbing structure and sat down with 18 inches between them and watched Theo assess the available equipment. The Harding's lawyer filed a motion yesterday, Damien said. I heard through my own team. I know. Catherine told me. It won't change anything. It's a delay tactic. Will it delay long enough to... No. She watched Theo reach the bottom of the ladder and begin the serious business of climbing. Hartwell says the evidence is sufficient regardless of the delay. Eleanor Harding's lawyers can slow the process, but they can't change what the records coordinator said, or what Hess documented, or what the wire transfers show. Damien was quiet for a moment. Your mother would have filed, he said. She had everything she needed. Yes. And they killed her before she could. Yes, he was quiet again. She didn't try to fill the silence. It was a cold, clear morning, the kind Boston produces in late November, where the air is sharp enough to feel like information, and the sky is entirely without ambiguity. Theo reached the top of the ladder and looked back at her with satisfaction.
Top, he said.
Top, she agreed. He went down the slide with the focused intensity he brought to Most's, landed at the bottom, and immediately turned to go back up. He does everything twice, Damien said. At least. Sometimes 4 or 5 times. To make sure he has it right? She looked at her son working his way back up the ladder. I think he just likes the feeling of being good at something. Once isn't enough. He wants to really know it. Damien absorbed this. She could feel him filing it, storing it, the way a man stores information about a person he is only beginning to understand he needs to know. I want to be part of his life, Damien said. I know I don't have the right to demand anything. I know what he stopped. Started again. I know what I did. On the wedding night and before it, and in the way I thought about you, before I ever met you. I know what all of that was. Good, she said. He looked at her. I mean that, she said. It's good that you know. A lot of men in your position would spend this conversation explaining why they weren't as bad as they were. I was as bad as I was. Yes, they sat with this. I'm not asking for forgiveness, he said. I'm not asking you to be my wife. I'm asking if I can know my son. She had thought about this question for 10 days in the mornings, before Theo woke up, and in the evenings after he went to bed, and in the interstitial spaces of the DA's proceedings, and Catherine's calls, and the coverage she read and closed, and the sleep she got only in stretches. She had thought about it with the particular rigor she applied to things that mattered, turning it over, and examining it from multiple angles, trying to find the version of the answer that was right, rather than simply safe, or simply generous, or simply punishing. Yes, she said, under conditions. Name them. No security detail around Theo. No business conversations in his presence, or on the days you see him. No manipulation of him, of me, of the circumstances. If that changes at any point, it stops. Understood. and he doesn't know who you are to him until he's old enough to ask the question himself. Right now he needs a person, not a concept. Damien nodded slowly. What do I tell him I am? She thought about this. Tell him you're someone who's going to be around. He looked at Theo, who had reached the top of the ladder for the second time and was now examining the slide with the expression of someone considering a methodological variation. Someone who's going to be around, Damien repeated. It's the truth, she said. Make it the truth and we'll figure out the rest as he grows. Theo went down the slide differently, this time faster, arms up, and landed at the bottom and looked at both of them with triumph. Fast, he said. Very fast, Serena said. He looked at Damien. He had been looking at Damien in intervals since they arrived. The sideways assessment of a toddler who is cataloging a new person without the social obligation to be subtle about it. You, Theo said, pointing at Damien. Me, Damien said. Theo considered this for a moment. Then he held out the wooden train. The gesture was not casual. Theo was specific about the train. It did not leave his possession except by his own decision. Serena had seen him extend it to Marija in Slovenia and to Anna upstairs and to the pediatrician who had been particularly kind at the last appointment. It was not an offering he made to everyone. Damien looked at the train. He looked at the small hand holding it out. He looked at the expression on Theo's face, serious, assessing, containing within it some 2-year-old's version of an evaluation that he could not have articulated, but which was, Serena understood, entirely real. He reached out and took the train carefully. He turned it over in his hands. He examined the wheels, which Theo had been examining since Slovenia, testing the different resistance in each direction. The wheels, Damien said. Wheeze, Theo confirmed, nodding. This one spins easier. Theo pointed at it. That one. That one, Damien agreed. He handed it back. Theo received it with the satisfaction of someone whose observation has been confirmed by an independent source, and turned and walked back to the ladder. Serena watched Damien watch her son climb. She thought about the man in the file that Ellis Crane had brought him 3 years ago, the photograph, the schedule, the personality profile of a woman who needed stability and could be managed by someone who understood that need. She thought about what Damien had done with that file and what she had done with the consequences of it and what had grown, improbably, in the wreckage. He's extraordinary, Damien said quietly. He is, she said. He came from difficult circumstances and he has no idea about any of them. And that's the greatest thing I've ever managed to do. Damien heard this without fencing himself against it, which was the right response. They sat on the bench until Theo had exhausted the slide's possibilities and moved on to a structure involving a bridge and a tunnel, which required both of them to be attentive in shifts, and the morning moved around them at its own pace, unhurried. The cold air and the bare trees and the sounds of a park in November that didn't know or care what had happened in the preceding weeks. The first Harding plea came in December. Richard Harding, Eleanor's son, accepted a negotiated plea on 2 counts of financial conspiracy and 1 count of obstruction. His cooperation was partial enough to reduce his exposure without fully implicating his mother, which his lawyers had evidently determined was the optimal position. Hartwell was not satisfied with the partial cooperation, but accepted it as useful. Eleanor's trial was scheduled for the following spring. Dalton Hess, the pharmaceutical contact, negotiated separately. His cooperation was complete, detailed, documented, and damning enough to give the prosecution everything it needed on the homicide question. The charge against Eleanor Harding was upgraded in January. Serena received the notification of the upgrade from Catherine in a 2-line email on a Tuesday afternoon while she was reviewing drawings at the architecture desk she had set up in the 2nd bedroom of the Cambridge apartment, which she had extended her lease on through the following year. Theo was at a half-day program nearby, a small, cheerful place with outdoor space and an approach to 2-year-olds that involved taking their interests seriously, which Theo had identified as correct and had therefore accepted. She read the email twice. She sat for a moment. Then she opened the drawer of the desk and took out a photograph she had placed there 3 weeks after the arrests. It was a photograph of her mother at 45. Standing in front of a building she had restored in the South End, a former textile warehouse converted to housing, which had been Margaret's first major public project and which she had talked about with a particular pride that was less about the recognitions and more about the fact that the building was still standing, had been standing for a century and a half, and would continue to stand because someone had understood what was worth saving. Margaret was squinting into the sun in the photograph. She was not posed. She was in the middle of saying something to whoever was holding the camera, one hand raised slightly, as though she was in the middle of a point she hadn't finished making. She looked like herself. Serena looked at the photograph for a long moment. They upgraded the charge, she said to it. She felt slightly absurd saying it, and said it anyway. She put the photograph back in the drawer. She met Claire in February, not at Catherine's office. At a coffee shop in Brookline that was halfway between where each of them lived. Serena had looked it up on a map and found the midpoint deliberately because the logistics of the meeting mattered less than the fact that she had set them up with care. Claire was already there. She was sitting at a table near the window with a cup she hadn't drunk from, and she looked up when Serena came in with the particular alertness of someone who has been anticipating something long enough that the anticipation has become its own kind of exhaustion. She looked older. Not dramatically 4 months, not 4 years. But the composed surface that Claire had always maintained, the managed quality of her presentation, had something underneath it now that hadn't been there before. A visibility. Something that the surface no longer fully covered. Serena sat down. She ordered a coffee from the server who appeared. Claire ordered nothing. They looked at each other. "You don't have to forgive me," Claire said. "I'm not here for that." "Then what are you here for?" "To tell you I'm sorry." Claire's voice was flat and specific, not performed. "Not for the situation or the circumstances, or any of the ways I've constructed it in my own head to make it livable. I'm sorry for what I did. I passed information that helped them silence Mom. I told myself it would stop at the complaint. I was lying to myself. I knew what kind of people they were." Serena wrapped her hands around her coffee cup. "Did you know before she died?" she said. "Did you know what they were going to do?" Claire looked at her. "No. I need to believe that." "I know. I don't know if I do." "I know that too," Claire said. She looked at the table. "I've told the prosecutor everything I know, everything I remember, every conversation I had with anyone at the Hardings from the beginning. If it helps send Eleanor Harding to prison, I'm glad. It doesn't make what I did different." "No," Serena said. "It doesn't." They were quiet. Outside the window, a February morning moved past people in heavy coats, bare sidewalks, the low gray sky of a city in winter. "I want to ask you something," Claire said. Serena waited. "Theo, your son." Claire's voice was careful. "I'd like to meet him. Someday. When you're ready, if you're ever ready." She paused. "He's Margaret's grandchild. He should know that she existed." Serena looked at her sister. She thought about the photograph in the drawer, Margaret squinting into the sun, one hand raised, in the middle of a point she hadn't finished making. She thought about what she wanted Theo to know about his grandmother and who she wanted to tell him. Someday, she said. It was not a promise. Claire knew it was not a promise and accepted it as the thing it was, a door that hadn't been closed. She nodded once, pressed her lips together, and picked up her coffee cup for the first time. They sat together for another 20 minutes and talked about things that were not the case: a building Claire had seen in the news, the half-day program Theo attended, the architecture project in Somerville that Serena was nearly finished with. Careful, surface-level conversation, the kind that doesn't ask much of anyone and doesn't pretend to be more than it is. It was not reconciliation. It was two women sitting at a table in February trying to determine whether the thing that had broken between them was the kind of break that eventually mends or the kind that doesn't, and being honest enough with themselves not to answer that question prematurely. When Serena left, she walked 2 blocks before she allowed herself to feel what the conversation had cost her, and then she felt it fully, standing at a corner with the cold wind off the street and her hands in her pockets, and when it passed, she crossed the street and went to pick up her son. Eleanor Harding's trial began in April. Serena testified on the 3rd day. She sat in the witness box, in a gray suit her mother would have approved of, the approval based on practicality rather than elegance, Margaret's primary criterion for clothing, and she answered every question Hartwell's team put her with the same precision she had applied to every other step of the process. She did not look at Eleanor Harding often. When she did, she saw an old woman in a well-cut suit with an expression of composed contempt that Serena understood was not about Serena specifically, but about the entire proceeding, and the idea that consequences could reach the level of the table at which. Eleanor Harding had sat for 60 years making decisions about what other people were worth. She looked away from Eleanor Harding and answered the questions. She was on the stand for 4 hours. She drove to the park afterward where Damien was with Theo. This had become, over the winter, a reliable arrangement: Damien and Theo at the park on Thursday afternoons, Serena arriving partway through, the three of them coexisting in the careful, unresolved configuration that they had arrived at, and which had proved more functional than she had initially expected. Damien was better with Theo than she had anticipated. He was not naturally easy with children. He had the quality of someone learning a new language, still translating each interaction before responding, but he was patient with his own awkwardness in a way he had never been patient with anything. And Theo had responded to his consistency with the uncomplicated acceptance that toddlers extend to people who show up reliably and take their interests seriously. She came through the gate and saw them at the base of the climbing structure. Damien was on one knee in the wood chips, holding a section of a stick that Theo had apparently presented to him for evaluation. He was examining it with the gravity Theo expected from collaborative investigations. Theo was crouched beside him, pointing out specific features. She stood at the gate and watched this for a moment before either of them saw her. She thought about what she felt watching it. It wasn't the feeling she would have predicted a year ago. It wasn't warmth exactly, and it wasn't grief, and it wasn't the complicated mixture of anger and exhaustion that had characterized most of her thinking about Damien for 4 years. It was something quieter, an acknowledgement of something complicated becoming, slowly, slightly less complicated. Not resolved, not transformed, just less sharp at the edges than it had been. Theo saw her, Mama. He held up the stick. Good stick, she said, walking toward them. Damien looked up and stood. He looked at her face the 4 hours in the witness box, she supposed, still visible to someone who knew what to look for. How did it go? He said quietly. It went, she said. He nodded. He didn't push for more, which was correct. Theo had transferred his attention back to the stick, which had implications he was still working out. She's going to be convicted, Serena said. Not to Damien specifically. To the cold April air, to the bare beginning trees showing the first small leaves, to the fact of saying it out loud. Yes, Damien said, it won't bring my mother back. No. But she'll know that what she did didn't stay buried, that somebody came back and dug it up. She watched Theo examine the stick. That's what I came back for. Not the verdict, the digging. Damien was quiet for a moment. Margaret would have done the same. Serena looked at him. It was an unexpected thing for him to say. He had met Margaret Vale only 3 times, at formal functions, and she had been reserved with him in the particular way. She was reserved with men who held power they hadn't earned through visible effort. She had not been unkind. She had not been warm. She would have done exactly the same, Serena said, and she would have been more efficient about it. Something moved through Damien's expression, not a smile exactly, but adjacent to one. The kind of expression that lives in the vicinity of genuine feeling without quite becoming it, in a man who has spent decades keeping the two things separate. Theo abandoned the stick. He walked to Damien and held up both arms in the gesture that meant he wanted to be picked up, which he extended to people selectively and which he's had, over the winter, extended to Damien with increasing frequency. Damien picked him up. Theo settled against his shoulder with the weight of someone who has decided a person is reliable, patted Damien's coat with one hand in a gesture that contained within it some toddler expression of assessment and approval, and looked at the park with the satisfaction of someone surveying territory he has fully understood. Serena stood beside them. The 3 of them, in the April afternoon, complicated, unresolved, carrying the weight of everything that had brought them to this specific point, in this specific park, on this specific day, simply occupied the space together for a moment without needing it to be more than what it was. Eleanor Harding was convicted in May, 22 years. The judge cited the premeditated nature, the length of the conspiracy, and the deliberate obstruction of justice over 4 subsequent years. Serena received the verdict by text from Hartwell at 3:18 in the afternoon while she was at her desk reviewing a proposal for a building in Somerville's outer edge, an old mill structure that someone wanted to convert to mixed use, and which had a foundation problem that needed to be addressed before any of the conversion plans were meaningful. She read the text. She set the phone down. She picked up the photograph from the drawer and looked at it. Margaret in the sun, hand raised, in the middle of saying something. 22 years, Serena said. She sat with it. Then she put the photograph back in the drawer and returned to the foundation problem, which was real and specific and required her full attention, and which was the kind of problem old and structural and more complicated than it appeared that she knew Screenza exactly how to solve. In June, Damien returned the wedding ring. He arrived at the apartment on a Sunday, a planned visit, Theo expecting him, already dressed in the truck shirt that remained his formal wear of preference, and he came in and Theo immediately redirected him toward the train layout that had been under construction since Thursday, and which had reached an architectural complexity that required a second opinion. Serena made coffee. When Theo was absorbed in explaining the track design to Damien, Damien reached into his coat pocket and set something on the kitchen counter. She looked at it. The ring. She picked it up. It was exactly as she remembered it, simple, well-made, the kind of thing chosen by someone who understood quality without needing to announce it. She had worn it for 6 weeks. She had not thought about it in 4 years. I kept it, he said. I don't know exactly why. I told myself different things at different times. She held the ring in her palm. She thought about the woman who had worn it, who had sat at the wedding table and smiled for the cameras and gone home and been patient and careful and methodical, who had rebuilt herself in a hillside apartment in Slovenia with a son she had made from the wreckage of a calculated betrayal. That woman had not needed the ring to know who she was. She didn't need it now either. But she accepted it, because accepting it was honest, it was acknowledging that it had existed, that the marriage had been real, even if everything that produced it had been false, that Theo had come from somewhere, and that somewhere was the complicated history between herself and this man in her kitchen, watching their son explain train engineering. She put the ring in her handbag, not on her finger. In her handbag, where it would exist as what it was, a historical object, belonging to a chapter that was finished. Damien, she said. He looked at her. What you did at the beginning, the file, the calculation, the marriage. I'm not going to spend the rest of my life managing my anger about it. I'm also not going to pretend it didn't happen. I know. You're Theo's father. That's real. What you do with it from here is your work, not mine. He held her gaze. I understand. Good. From the floor, Theo said, "Da." Bridge. She watched Damien turn toward her son with the expression of a man who is still learning how to be what his son needs him to be, and who has decided, for reasons that were perhaps the first genuinely unselfish decision he had ever made, that the learning was worth whatever it cost him. He sat down on the floor. Bridge, he said, show me. She was back at the architecture desk when the building happened. Not the Somerville project, a different one. A call she received in July from a heritage trust in Boston that had been given oversight of a waterfront structure built in 1887, a former customs building that had been modified badly twice in the 20th century, and which was now in a state of confused identity, not old enough to be left alone, not new enough to be abandoned, needing someone who could read what it originally was and understand what it could become. She drove to the waterfront on a Tuesday morning to look at it. She stood on the sidewalk outside and looked up at the facade, the original stonework still visible beneath the modifications, the bones of the thing intact even where the surface had been obscured, and she felt the specific pull of a problem she knew how to solve. Not quickly, not cleanly. Nothing worthwhile was either of those things. But solvable, she took photographs. She made notes. She stood in the July sun outside a building that had survived 130 years of people deciding what it should be, and she thought about what it actually was and what it needed, and how you bring something back from the distortions that can accumulate when people treat a structure as a thing to be used rather than a thing to be understood. She went home. Theo was awake from his nap, sitting on the floor with a new block set that had been added to the train infrastructure as a secondary system. He looked up when she came in. "Mama back," he said. "Mama's back," she confirmed. She put her bag down. She sat on the floor beside him. She looked at what he was building, a tower, careful and considered, each block placed with the particular attention of someone who has learned that the early decisions determine the stability of everything that comes after. She picked up a block. "Here," she said, indicating a position in the structure. He examined it. He shook his head. He pointed to a different position. "There," he said. She placed it where he indicated. The tower held. She looked at her son, who was already reaching for the next block, already thinking 3 moves ahead, already building the thing he'd see in his mind toward the thing he was making in the world. And she understood that that's exactly this, the daily, ordinary, persistent work of building something real, was what she had come back from Slovenia for. Not the verdict, not the ring, not the resolution of anything with Damien or the system or the Hardings or even Claire. This, her son's hands on the blocks, her own hands beside them. The tower standing in the afternoon light in a Cambridge apartment where the maple outside the window was fully green now, summer green, and the city outside moved at its own pace through its own ordinary purposes, and she was not hiding, and she was not running, and she was not managing anyone's perception of her strength. She was simply here, building, with the person she had made in the life she had chosen, on a foundation that had been tested by everything that could test a foundation and had held. It had held. She placed the next block. Theo placed the one after it. The tower rose.